At my 30th birthday party, I quietly moved my entire multi-million-dollar inheritance from my grandparents into a trust just to be safe. The very next morning, my parents and younger sister sat across from me at a country club brunch and casually announced they had just sold my property behind my back. They threw a check in my face and told me to be grateful. They had no idea they had just walked into a federal trap I spent years designing. My name is Alyssa, 32 years old, working as a senior forensic accountant. I spend my days tracking down hidden assets, unraveling corporate fraud, and destroying financial criminals. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family that tried to take everything from you. We were sitting in this private dining room of the most exclusive country club in Austin, Texas. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the white linen tablecloths and the expensive silverware. We were supposedly there to celebrate my parents' anniversary. I had even brought a rare bottle of wine to share. The waiter had barely cleared our appetizer plates when my father Thomas reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a crisp cashier check and slid it across the smooth marble table. It stopped right next to my champagne glass. $50,000. I stared at the numbers printed on the paper, my forensic accounting brain immediately calculating the absolute absurdity of the sum. I looked up at his completely unbothered face. "Take it," Thomas commanded, adjusting his expensive tie with an air of absolute authority. "Your mother and I officially closed the sale on the downtown Austin commercial building your grandfather left you. The wire transfer cleared this morning." I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not give them the emotional breakdown they were so clearly waiting for. My hands did not even shake. I simply placed my index finger on the crisp paper and slid it right back toward his plate. "What gave you the right to sell a property with my name on the deed?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Is this going to be an exact replay of the time you emptied my college fund to pay for Britney's disastrous European influencer tour?" My mother Brenda slammed her wine glass down hard enough to slosh expensive Merlot onto the pristine tablecloth. "Do not be selfish, Alyssa." She snapped, her eyes narrowing with that familiar disdain she had reserved exclusively for me since childhood. "You make a ridiculous salary tracking down missing money for corporations. You do not need that old building. Your sister is trying to build a family. She needs a secure future." The building in question was not just any piece of real estate. It was a prime historic block in the heart of downtown Austin. My grandfather had purchased it decades ago, when the area was nothing but abandoned warehouses. He saw potential where others saw ruin. He and I were alike in that way. When he passed away 3 years ago, he left the entire estate exclusively to me, completely bypassing my father. My grandfather knew exactly how financially reckless my parents were, and he knew they would liquidate his life's work to fund their superficial lifestyle. I had spent the last 3 years quietly maintaining the property, allowing the current commercial leases to generate a steady, protected income. My father hated that I held the keys to a fortune while he was constantly bleeding cash to keep up appearances at the country club. He hated that I refused to hand over the deed when he demanded it right after the funeral, so he had bided his time. My father leaned forward, lowering his voice so the other wealthy club members would not hear our dispute. "I used the general power of attorney you signed when you turned 18, he stated matter-of-factly. "The one we told you was required for your student loan applications. I kept it in my safe all these years. It is perfectly legal. We had to move fast to get the cash." DeAndre's new real estate syndicate was facing a massive financial shortfall, and we needed to bail out his project before it collapsed entirely. I looked across the table at my younger sister Brittany and her husband DeAndre. Brittany was 29, perpetually unemployed, yet dressed in head-to-toe designer labels completely subsidized by my parents. She sat there with a smug, entitled expression, absent-mindedly rubbing her flat stomach. Next to her sat DeAndre. He was a 33-year-old Black American man who loved to project the image of a wealthy real estate visionary. He wore a flashy suit that looked expensive from a distance, but was cheap up close, much like his business ventures. DeAndre ran sketchy investment schemes that consistently lost money, requiring my parents to constantly act as his personal bailout bank. They were all staring at me, expecting me to crumble. This was their pattern. They had spent my entire life taking from me to give to Brittany. When I was a child, they threw away my art projects to make room for Brittany's participation trophies. When I was working 2 jobs to pay my own way through college, they were buying Brittany a brand new car for barely passing her freshman classes. They thought I was still that powerless girl they could walk all over. They assumed that because I was quiet, I was weak. Sitting at this pristine table watching them chew their $200 steaks, paid for by my stolen inheritance, the audacity of the check felt almost suffocating. They were trying to throw me a bone, a pathetic allowance to keep me quiet while they stole millions to prop up my sister's failing husband. Instead of giving them the hysterical reaction they craved, I picked up the check again. I held it up to the light of the crystal chandelier above us, admiring the security watermarks, as if evaluating a piece of counterfeit art. $50,000, I said softly, letting the silence stretch around the table. A $50,000 buyout for a commercial property that was recently appraised at $4.2 million. My father scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. You do not know how to manage commercial real estate, Alyssa. You sit behind a desk looking at spreadsheets all day. You should be grateful we negotiated to get you anything at all from this deal. You owe this family for raising you. I lowered the check and smiled, a cold, calculating smile that made my mother physically recoil in her seat. The air in the room suddenly felt very heavy. You really think I am the same naive teenager from 14 years ago? I asked. DeAndre let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the mahogany-paneled walls of the private dining room. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing one ankle over his knee, and aggressively swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass. The ice clinked against the rim, a sharp, arrogant sound that perfectly matched his manufactured persona. Listen to yourself, Alyssa. DeAndre said, his tone dripping with the kind of thick condescension usually reserved for confused children. You are making this way more dramatic than it needs to be. I'm actually doing you a massive favor here. He took a slow, theatrical sip of his bourbon. He played the part of the high-rolling real estate guru, perfectly adjusting the cuffs of his flashy maroon suit jacket to ensure the massive gold watch on his wrist caught the light from the chandelier above us. Commercial real estate is not for the faint of heart, he continued, pointing his glass at me as if delivering a keynote speech. It takes vision. It takes serious capital. That old building of your grandfather is a massive liability. It is a crumbling mess of code violations, outdated electrical systems, and structural nightmares. You do not have the business acumen or the stomach to manage a property like that. My firm is acquiring it to develop a luxury mixed-use high-rise. We are taking a colossal tax burden off your shoulders. 50 grand is more than fair for a property you were just letting rot in the Texas sun. Brittany scoffed loudly from her seat, rolling her perfectly manicured eyes and crossing her arms over her designer blouse. God, Alyssa, you are so unbelievably ungrateful. DeAndre is stepping up to save this family, and you are throwing a fit over a building you never even visit. I turned my gaze to my younger sister. Save this family, I asked, keeping my voice completely steady. Is that what we are calling it now? Yes. Brittany snapped, her voice rising an octave, drawing a concerned glance from a passing waiter. He is a visionary. He is actually building generational wealth, unlike you sitting in some depressing corporate cubicle, crunching other people's numbers all day. You have never supported my marriage. You have never supported me. Just like when you maliciously refused to co-sign the commercial lease for my wellness boutique 2 years ago. I had to declare bankruptcy because you were too selfish to help your own sister achieve her dreams. You declared bankruptcy because you took $80,000 of small business capital and spent it on a personal luxury wardrobe and a month-long first-class trip to Dubai, I corrected her. My voice remained entirely devoid of emotion, cutting through her hysterical victimhood like a scalpel. And DeAndre is not a visionary. He is a predator, running out of prey. DeAndre slammed his glass down on the table. The heavy crystal thudded violently against the marble. You watch your mouth, he demanded, leaning forward to try and intimidate me with his physical presence. You do not know the first thing about the real world of high-level finance. I move millions of dollars before you even pour your morning coffee. I rested my hands on the table, interlacing my fingers. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and began to surgically dissect his entire existence right in front of his new family. The real world, I repeated, letting a small, razor-sharp smile touch my lips. Let us talk about the real world, DeAndre. Let us talk about that custom Italian suit you are wearing. It is a very nice cut, but the fabric pulling at the shoulders tells me it is off the rack. More importantly, the barcode tag you forgot to tuck in on the inside of your left lapel tells me you rented it from a high-end boutique in downtown Austin. DeAndre froze, his eyes widening. He instinctively shifted his left arm to hide the lapel, but the damage was already done. And that watch, I continued, my voice relentless and precise. A beautiful timepiece. Retail value is around $40,000, but you do not own it. You lease it through a luxury subscription service for $800 a month. A subscription that, according to public records I pulled this morning, is currently 2 months past due. My father, Thomas, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushing red. Alyssa, that is enough, he warned, trying to regain control of the table. I ignored him completely, keeping my eyes locked on my brother-in-law. You want to talk about high-level finance? I said, leaning closer to DeAndre, whose arrogant smirk had entirely vanished. I am a senior forensic accountant. I hunt down financial criminals for a living. I track money hidden in offshore accounts, shell companies, and fraudulent syndicates. I know exactly what your firm actually is, DeAndre. It is a localized Ponzi scheme. You take money from new investors to pay the guaranteed returns you promised to your old investors. But the well has run dry. You are drowning in debt, your previous investors are demanding their payouts, and your credit score is lower than my resting heart rate. Brittany gasped, turning to her husband with wide, panicked eyes. DeAndre, what is she talking about? She is lying. DeAndre stammered, beads of sweat suddenly appearing on his forehead, completely shattering his cool facade. She is just a jealous, bitter woman making up absolute garbage to ruin our night. I did not break eye contact with him. You needed a massive injection of capital immediately, or your entire house of cards was going to collapse. But no bank would ever lend to you. Your credit is completely destroyed. So you convinced my desperate, image-obsessed parents to illegally sell you my building using a 14-year-old piece of paper. You did not buy my building to develop a high-rise. You bought it so you could use the deed as collateral to secure a massive high-interest private loan to pay off the people you defrauded. DeAndre opened his mouth to shout another denial, but the words died in his throat. He looked around the room, panicking, realizing that I had just mapped out his entire criminal enterprise in front of my parents, stripping away every ounce of his unearned authority. I reached into my designer purse, slowly pulling out my phone. The screen glowed brightly in the dim, elegant lighting of the dining room. I tapped the screen once, bringing up a highly secured banking dashboard, and slid the phone across the smooth marble table. It glided silently until it stopped right in front of DeAndre. By the way, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper, check your business account. The $2 million loan you just leveraged against my building. I flagged it for suspicious activity 30 minutes ago. DeAndre snatched his phone off the marble table as if it were a live grenade. His manicured thumb aggressively tapped the screen, navigating to his banking app with frantic, jerky movements. I sat perfectly still and watched the exact moment his manufactured reality shattered. The blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly, ashen undertone beneath his skin. His breathing hitched loudly in the quiet dining room. He tapped the screen again, harder this time, his finger hitting the glass with an audible thwack, as if sheer physical force could change the bold red text glaring back at him. He shoved the screen toward my father. Thomas squinted at the bright phone display, and his confident patriarchal posture immediately collapsed. He slumped back into his chair, his mouth hanging open. Brenda let out a sharp, genuine gasp, her hand flying to clutch the string of pearls at her throat. The private dining room, previously filled with the quiet clinking of silver and crystal, suddenly felt like a high-pressure vacuum. The air was thick and suffocating. Brenda lunged across the table. Her fingers clamped down hard on my wrist, her perfectly manicured acrylic nails digging painfully into my skin. "Alyssa, call the bank right this second," she demanded. Her voice entirely abandoned its usual country club whisper, rising to a shrill, desperate pitch that caused two waiters by the door to turn and stare. "You call them right now and tell them you made a mistake. You tell them you approved the transfer. Do you hear me? You are not going to destroy your sister's marriage just because you are a bitter, jealous spinster who cannot find a man of your own." I looked down at her hand gripping my wrist, then slowly brought my eyes up to meet hers. The raw contempt in my gaze made her falter, but she did not let go. I deliberately reached over with my free hand, grabbed her wrist, and peeled her fingers off my arm one by one. I tossed her hand back toward her plate like it was a piece of dirty silverware. "I am not destroying anything, Mother," I said, my voice remaining dangerously calm. "DeAndre did that all by himself. And do not ever project your golden child's failures onto me again. You want to talk about destroying things? Let us talk about Brittany. Let us talk about the artisanal vegan candle company she started 3 years ago, the one you and Dad funded with $100,000 of your retirement savings. She bankrupted it in 6 months because she spent the entire manufacturing budget on an extravagant launch party. Let us talk about her luxury life coaching app the following year. Another $150,000 down the drain because she hired a celebrity public relations team to make herself look like a tech founder on social media instead of hiring software developers. I leaned forward, locking eyes with my mother. I spent the last 10 years working 80-hour weeks auditing fraudulent corporations, digging through financial garbage, and earning my CPA. I lived on instant coffee and cheap takeout to pay my own way through school. Meanwhile, you two subsidized a woman who has bankrupted 3 separate limited liability companies before her 30th birthday. You enabled her delusion, and now you are enabling his fraud. Brittany let out a loud theatrical sob, burying her face in her hands. She always knew exactly when to play the victim card to manipulate the room. "Mom, she is ruining my life!" Brittany wailed, her voice muffled by her hands, but loud enough to ensure everyone heard her misery. "She has always hated me. She has always been so jealous that you guys love me more. She just wants me to be as miserable and alone as she is. I am pregnant. I cannot handle this stress. She's going to hurt the baby with all this toxicity." DeAndre stood up suddenly, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward. It hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud. "Fix this, Alyssa," he ordered, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. His suave, untouchable persona had completely evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, cornered man. "I have contractors waiting. I have private lenders breathing down my neck. If that $2 million does not clear by tomorrow morning, I am dead in the water. My whole firm goes under. You are going to pick up that phone, call the fraud department, and authorize the release of those funds right now." I picked up my champagne flute and took a leisurely sip, savoring the crisp bubbles. I was completely unfazed by the towering, angry man trying to intimidate me. "I cannot do that, DeAndre," I replied cheerfully, setting the glass back down on the coaster. As a licensed senior forensic accountant, overriding a legitimate fraud alert on a massive wire transfer tied to a suspicious real estate transaction would be a severe violation of federal banking regulations. It would be an accessory to wire fraud. It would cost me my professional license and likely land me in federal prison. And unlike my sister, I actually value my career and my freedom. My father slammed both of his hands onto the table, making the china plates jump and rattle. The pale shock had left his face, replaced by a deep, furious crimson. He glared at me with absolute venom. For decades, Thomas had ruled our household through financial intimidation. If I ever stepped out of line, he cut off my resources. He truly believed he still held the reins. He thought he could still force me into submission through financial starvation, his favorite tactic. "You think you hold all the cards because you work at some fancy downtown accounting firm?" Thomas snarled, leaning across the table, his voice low and threatening. "You think you can just shut down our family business, humiliate your sister, and walk away unscathed? We anticipated you would throw a tantrum over the building. We knew you would be entirely unreasonable about helping your own flesh and blood. so I took precautions. I made a phone call of my own this morning. I froze the joint savings account we opened when you were 18. I know you deposit a large portion of your paycheck in there every single month because your name is still tied to mine on that ledger. You do not have a dime to your name until you cooperate and release DeAndre's funds. DeAndre stared at the screen of his phone as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. His thumb swiped down, refreshing the banking application over and over again. The bold red banner across the top of his digital dashboard did not change. Account frozen pending fraud investigation. The color completely drained from his face, leaving a sickly gray pallor. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, the arrogant bravado from just minutes ago entirely gone. "What did you do?" DeAndre choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "I have contractors scheduled to break ground tomorrow. I have private lenders who are going to bury me if that transfer does not clear." "You did this to yourself," I replied smoothly, leaning back in my chair. "When you try to leverage a stolen asset to cover the debts of a localized Ponzi scheme, you tend to trigger federal banking alerts. I just helped the system recognize the fraud a little faster." My mother slammed her hands on the table, her heavy diamond bracelets clanking loudly against the marble. "You undo this right now," Alyssa Brenda shrieked. "You call that bank and tell them it was a mistake. How dare you try to destroy your sister's marriage?" Brenda reached across the table and grabbed my forearm, her manicured nails digging into my skin. Her face was twisted with the same vicious rage I had seen 1,000 times before. "You have always been a bitter, jealous spinster," Brenda hissed, leaning in close. "You cannot stand that Brittany found a successful man who treats her like a queen. You cannot stand that she is building a beautiful family while you sit alone in a sterile condo with your spreadsheets. You are doing this out of pure malicious envy." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away immediately. I let her hold on just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable, then I calmly reached over and peeled her fingers off my skin. "Jealous," I repeated, letting a dry laugh escape my lips. "Let us talk about jealousy, Mother. Let us talk about the decade I spent working 80-hour weeks at a top accounting firm, building a spotless professional reputation. While I was doing that, you were busy funding Brittany's life. You expect me to be jealous of a woman who cannot even pay her own cell phone bill without Daddy dipping into his retirement fund. You think I am jealous of a man who has to defraud his own in-laws to keep his loan sharks at bay. I am not jealous. I am disgusted." Thomas stood up, throwing his linen napkin onto his half-eaten steak. He looked down at me with the absolute certainty of a man who believed he held all the power. He buttoned his suit jacket with a practiced, arrogant motion. "We knew you would be difficult about this," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a cold, authoritative register. "We anticipated you would throw a tantrum over the building and try to sabotage DeAndre's deal. Your mother and I knew you would refuse to help your sister because you have always been entirely selfish. So I took precautions." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for his grand revelation. "I called the bank this morning," Thomas continued, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. "I froze the joint savings account we opened when you were a teenager. I know you still deposit a large portion of your corporate salary into that account because your name is tied to mine on the ledger. You do not have a single dime to your name right now, Alyssa. Your credit cards are tied to that balance. Your auto pay is tied to that balance. You are completely locked out of your own money." Brittany let out a sharp, victorious laugh, wiping away her fake tears. "That is what you get," she sneered. "You have to fix DeAndre's account right now, or Dad is going to leave you completely broke." My father crossed his arms, waiting for me to panic. He was waiting for the moment my tough exterior shattered, the moment I realized I was financially trapped and forced to obey his commands. Instead, I calmly reached into my designer tote bag and pulled out my tablet. I did not flinch. I did not beg. I pressed a few buttons on the screen and connected my device to the large flat-screen television mounted on the wall of our private dining room. The screen flickered to life, displaying my secure financial dashboard in crisp, undeniable high definition. "You really do not understand what I do for a living, do you, Dad?" I asked, turning my gaze back to him. "I am a forensic accountant. I track missing money. I follow paper trails that financial criminals try to burn. I see everything." I tapped the screen, bringing up a detailed, highlighted ledger. Did you really think I would leave my life savings in an account with your name on it? I asked, gesturing to the television. I tracked you secretly draining our joint account 5 years ago to pay for Brittany's lavish destination wedding. I watched you siphon off $30,000 to cover the catering because you were too proud to admit you were broke. You thought I did not notice the missing funds because I never said a word. But I document everything. I tapped the screen one more time. The display shifted to the current balance of the joint savings account he claimed to have just frozen. The number on the screen read exactly $1.00. Thomas stared at the television, his triumphant smirk vanishing instantly. His face drained of color as the reality of the situation hit him. I drained that account 2 years ago. I stated, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. I moved every single cent of my corporate income into a secure offshore trust that you cannot touch. I left exactly $1 in that joint account just to keep it open. My father stood frozen, unable to tear his eyes away from the screen. Brenda covered her mouth in shock, her eyes darting between me and her husband. But here is the best part, Thomas. I continued, leaning forward and resting my hands on the marble table. By calling the bank and executing a hostile freeze on an account you share with a certified fraud examiner, you tripped a highly sensitive internal security protocol. The bank is legally obligated to report hostile freezes involving large sums of missing money. In your desperate rush to lock me out of an empty account, you just triggered an automatic comprehensive audit by the Internal Revenue Service on your own personal tax returns. The silence in the room was absolute. DeAndre looked like he was going to be sick. Brittany was staring at her phone, completely lost. And since I have seen your sloppy bookkeeping, I said, picking up my purse and standing up from the table, I know exactly how much undeclared income you have been hiding to subsidize Brittany's fake lifestyle. Enjoy the audit, Dad. Dinner is on you. The pristine quiet of my accounting firm was practically a sacred law. Located on the 40th floor of a downtown Austin high-rise, the office was a sanctuary of glass walls, polished chrome, and hushed conversations involving billions of corporate dollars. I was at my desk reviewing a particularly complex offshore shell company structure when the unmistakable sound of my mother shouting shattered the morning silence. "I need to speak to whoever is in charge of this place right now," Brenda shrieked. Her voice echoed down the long carpeted hallway, drawing the attention of every senior partner and junior associate within earshot. She pushed past our terrified receptionist, waving a heavily manicured finger in the air. I stood up slowly, smoothing the skirt of my tailored suit, and watched through the glass walls of my office as my family descended like a localized hurricane. Thomas marched right behind her, his face a mottled, unhealthy shade of purple, while DeAndre trailed them, looking less like a visionary real estate mogul and more like a man walking to his own execution. My managing partner, David, stepped out of his corner office. David was a ruthlessly effective former federal prosecutor who had built this firm into a fortress of forensic accounting. He crossed his arms over his chest, his expression completely unreadable, as he watched my parents storm toward my workspace. I caught his eye and gave a single calm nod. He leaned against the doorframe, clearly deciding to let me handle the circus before calling building security. Alyssa, Thomas bellowed, shoving my glass door open so hard it bounced against the stopper. "You are going to fix this. You are going to fix what you did to my bank accounts, and then you are going to resign. I will not have a thief working in a respectable financial institution." Brenda elbowed her way past him, planting her hands firmly on my mahogany desk. "She is a thief," Brenda announced loudly, ensuring that David and the gathering crowd of associates could hear every word. "She stole her own family's money. She hid her income, she triggered an IRS audit to destroy her father, and she is actively trying to sabotage her brother-in-law's legitimate business deal. You need to fire her immediately before she embezzles from your clients." I did not raise my voice. I did not break character. I simply opened the bottom drawer of my desk, unlocked it with a biometric scan, and pulled out a heavy black leather binder. I dropped it onto the center of my desk with a resounding thud that made my mother flinch. "I want to explain something to you," I said, speaking slowly and clearly, using the exact tone one might use to explain basic arithmetic to a stubborn toddler. You came into a forensic accounting firm to accuse a senior auditor of theft. That is remarkably stupid even for you. I flipped the heavy binder open. The pages inside were densely packed with transaction logs, highlighted bank transfers, and notarized property records. This is a legally binding ledger of the grandfather's estate, spanning the last 10 years, I explained, turning the ledger so it faced them. Let us talk about who the real thieves are, shall we? 7 years ago, Thomas, you illegally transferred $45,000 from the estate maintenance fund to cover your country club dues and a golf trip to Scotland. 5 years ago, Brenda, you forged my grandfather's signature on a power of attorney document that allowed you to withdraw $200,000 to pay for Brittany's ridiculous destination wedding in Cabo. My parents froze. The righteous indignation vanished from their faces, replaced by a sudden creeping terror. You bled his estate dry while he was still alive. I continued, tapping my index finger against the meticulously documented pages. You misappropriated exactly $482,000 over a decade. I tracked every dime. I verified every IP address used for the digital transfers. I even pulled the surveillance footage from the bank branches where you made the fraudulent cash withdrawals. I did not steal anything. I simply stopped you from stealing the one asset he managed to protect by leaving it exclusively to me. David let out a low, appreciative whistle from the doorway. He was a man who respected bulletproof documentation above all else. Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward David and the other accountants watching the spectacle. You cannot prove any of that, he muttered, though his voice lacked any real conviction. I am a forensic accountant, Dad, I reminded him gently, proving it is literally what they pay me to do. If you do not leave this office right now, I will hand this entire binder over to the local district attorney before my lunch break. Brenda looked like she was about to faint. She grabbed Thomas by the sleeve, tugging him backward toward the door. Thomas looked completely defeated, his grand plan of financial intimidation totally dismantled by basic, undeniable facts. They had nothing left. But DeAndre was not retreating. The panic that had been simmering in his eyes since the restaurant last night had boiled over into something frantic and highly dangerous. He shoved his way past my parents, stepping directly up to my desk. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. He slammed a stamped, notarized document down directly on top of my ledger. You think you are so smart? DeAndre sneered, spit flying from his lips as he leaned across the desk. You think you can just lock me out of my accounts and undo this? You are too late, Alyssa. I glanced down at the paper. It was the property deed to my grandfather's downtown Austin building. But it was not just a copy. It bore the unmistakable blue ink stamp of the county clerk's office. The sale is already registered with the county, DeAndre declared, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and dark triumph. The title transfer is officially on the public record. That building belongs to my firm now, and you cannot stop what has already been set in motion. I kept my face perfectly still, but a cold spike of genuine concern hit my stomach. County registration usually took days. He had paid someone off to expedite it. I already leveraged the property. DeAndre continued, leaning in closer, a desperate, manic grin spreading across his sweating face. I did not just get a loan from a bank. Banks ask too many questions. I took a non-refundable $1 million deposit from a private third-party investor. An investor who does not care about your little ledgers or your IRS audits. An investor who expects a luxury high-rise to be built on that dirt, or they are going to come looking for their money. He tapped the stamped deed with a shaking finger. The money is gone, Alyssa. I already wired it offshore to cover my old debts. If you try to reverse this sale now, if you try to take that building back, that investor is not going to come after me. They hold the lien on the property. They are going to come after you. I looked down at the documents DeAndre had practically thrown at me. The arrogant certainty in his voice clashed violently with the nervous sweat beading on his upper lip. He truly believed he had backed me into a corner. He thought that by introducing a ruthless third party, he had successfully transferred his immense liability onto my shoulders. David, my managing partner, remained leaning against the doorframe, silently observing the impending slaughter. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached out and pulled the stamped deed and the attached investor agreement toward the center of my desk. I ran my finger over the blue ink of the county clerk stamp. It was authentic. DeAndre had clearly bribed a low-level official to fast-track the filing before I could intervene and freeze the asset transfer. But the deed was the least interesting piece of paper on my desk. It was the attached investor contract that caught my professional attention. It was a spectacular mess of boilerplate legal jargon masking a highly predatory lending agreement. Walk me through this brilliant business model of yours, DeAndre, I said, keeping my tone light and conversational as if we were discussing the weather. Explain to me how your syndicate generates the kind of capital that requires a non-refundable $1 million deposit on a commercial property you acquired less than 24 hours ago. DeAndre puffed out his chest, his fragile ego momentarily overriding his panic. He fell right back into his rehearsed sales pitch. We leverage prime urban commercial zones, he stated, straightening his maroon tie. We guarantee our private partners double-digit quarterly returns. We pool syndicated capital to execute rapid high-yield flips. My firm acts as the aggressive intermediary. This investor saw the immense value of the downtown lot and wired the deposit to secure the development rights. It is standard high-level commercial strategy. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It is standard financial suicide, I corrected him, picking up a red pen. Double-digit quarterly returns in the current Austin commercial real estate market are a mathematical impossibility. You are not executing rapid flips. You are pooling new money from fresh victims to pay off the initial investors before they realize there are no actual profits being generated. It is the textbook definition of a Ponzi scheme. You took this $1 million to stop the bleeding, but you just severed a major artery instead. Brenda slammed her hand on the back of my guest chair. Do not speak to him like that, she demanded, her voice shaking with desperate fury. He is a legitimate businessman. He is trying to build an empire for your sister. He is a serial con artist, mother, I snapped, dropping the red pen. The sharp clatter echoed in the quiet office. This is exactly what he did 3 years ago. Did you really think I forgot about his revolutionary nutritional supplement distribution network? It was a thinly veiled, multi-level marketing scam that left 50 vulnerable people entirely bankrupt. You and Dad quietly paid out over $400,000 in out-of-court settlements to keep him out of federal prison. You liquidated your own stock portfolios, all so Brittany could keep playing the role of the wealthy entrepreneur's wife at her country club luncheons. You enabled a fraudster then, and you are enabling a fraudster now just to protect a delusional fantasy. Thomas stepped forward, his face pale and drawn. That was different, he insisted, though his voice lacked any real authority. He was young. He made some operational mistakes. This is backed by hard real estate. There is a legitimate third-party investor holding a lien on your property, Alyssa. You have to honor the contract or they will come after you for the deposit. I turned my attention back to the hastily printed investor agreement. A legitimate investor, I mused, tracing the name of the limited liability company printed at the top of the deposit receipt. Apex Horizon Holdings, LLC. I turned to my computer monitors. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, bringing up the highly secure corporate registry databases I use daily to track illicit funds. You see, DeAndre, when you run a fraudulent syndicate, you eventually run out of gullible country club friends to exploit. Your local reputation burns to the ground. You get desperate. You start soliciting funds from alternative capital streams online. You put feelers out into the shadow markets, promising astronomical returns to absolutely anyone willing to wire cash fast. I clicked through 3 layers of corporate shielding in less than 30 seconds. The screen reflected a complex web of shell companies, blind trusts, and offshore routing numbers. You saw a willing lender, and you took the cash blindly. I continued, keeping my eyes on the data cascading across my screen. You did not run a single background check. You did not verify the source of the capital. You just saw $1 million and grabbed it like a drowning man grabbing a razor blade. DeAndre swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The money cleared, he stammered. The bank accepted the wire. That is all that matters. I stopped typing. The final layer of the corporate shell structure dissolved on my monitor, revealing the ultimate beneficial owner of the funds. The silence in my office was deafening. Even David pushed himself off the doorframe, stepping slightly closer to view the screen. I looked up from the monitors, locking my eyes directly onto DeAndre. I let a slow, chilling smile form on my face. DeAndre, this third-party investor? I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, perfectly articulated whisper. Did you realize you just took $1 million from a shell company tied directly to the Gulf Coast cartel? DeAndre stared at the glowing monitor, as if it were a bomb about to detonate. The blood entirely abandoned his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He stumbled backward, his shoulders hitting the glass wall of my office with a dull thud. "You are lying!" DeAndre stammered, raising a trembling hand to wipe the thick layer of sweat forming across his forehead. "You altered that data. You are just trying to scare me into backing down." Apex Horizon is a legitimate investment group out of Miami. My broker vetted them. "Your broker is an idiot who is going to end up in a federal penitentiary," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of sympathy. "Or worse, he is going to end up answering to a cartel lieutenant who wants to know why their clean money is tied up in a frozen Texas real estate transaction." You did not just commit real estate fraud, DeAndre. You invited a transnational criminal syndicate into your family's living room. Brenda let out a sharp gasp, clutching Thomas by the arm. "Thomas, do something," she demanded, her voice shrill with rising panic. "Tell her to stop making up these ridiculous stories." Before my father could formulate another pathetic defense, the heavy oak doors of our suite swung open down the hall. A man in a sharply tailored, overly shiny silver suit marched down the corridor. He carried a leather briefcase and wore an expression of unwarranted supreme confidence. He shoved past a junior associate and stepped directly into my office, coming to a halt next to DeAndre. "This is Marcus Vance," DeAndre announced, his chest puffing out slightly as he tried to regain a fraction of his shattered bravado. "He is my primary legal counsel. I called him on the way up here." Vance did not bother with pleasantries. He placed his briefcase on one of my guest chairs, snapped the brass latches open, and withdrew a thick stack of legal documents. He looked at me with the kind of condescending smirk that mediocre men reserve for women they desperately underestimate. "Miss Wilson," Vance began, his voice dripping with practiced sleaze, "my client has informed me of your rather dramatic attempts to interfere with his legitimate business operations. Let me make this incredibly simple for you. You are currently engaging in tortious interference with a highly lucrative commercial contract. If you do not immediately release the hold on the property deed and unfreeze the associated banking channels, I will file a multi-million-dollar civil suit against you and this firm before the courthouse closes today." David, still leaning against the doorframe, let out a short, dry chuckle. Vance shot him a dark look but turned his attention back to me. Furthermore, Vance continued pulling a specific yellowed piece of paper from his stack and slapping it down on the center of my desk. "Your claim that this building was stolen is entirely baseless. Your father, Thomas Wilson, executed the sale using a perfectly legal notarized power of attorney. He is your recognized fiduciary proxy. He had the irrevocable assignment to liquidate that asset to prevent a family financial hardship." Vance tapped the paper with a manicured finger. "You have no legal standing to halt this transaction. You are an employee of an accounting firm, not a judge. Stand down, or I will make sure you never work in the financial sector again." I did not flinch. I did not move to touch the document he had thrown on my desk. Instead, I calmly picked up my coffee cup, took a slow sip, and set it back down on its coaster. "Mr. Vance," I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the desk, "you are citing irrevocable assignment under a fiduciary proxy. That is a fascinating choice of legal jargon. However, it is entirely inapplicable here. I suggest you review Title 18, Section 1014 of the United States Code regarding loan and credit applications, specifically concerning fraudulent inducements." Vance narrowed his eyes, the condescending smirk slipping slightly. You see, I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the glass walls. While my parents were busy paying for my sister to fail out of 3 different private universities, I was spending my evenings auditing federal financial law courses. I knew exactly what kind of man my father was. I knew he viewed my grandfather's inheritance as his personal piggy bank. I spent 4 years studying corporate compliance banking regulations and federal fraud statutes specifically to build an impenetrable legal fortress against my own family. I pointed to the paper on my desk. Under the Uniform Commercial Code, a power of attorney cannot be utilized to execute a transaction that constitutes a blatant conflict of interest or self-dealing. Your client Thomas used this document to sell an asset to his own son-in-law for exactly $0, just so DeAndre could leverage it for $1 million cartel loan to cover his failing Ponzi scheme. That is not a fiduciary action. That is a textbook conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Vance opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off smoothly. And since you have formally attached your name as legal counsel to this specific transaction, I added, giving him a polite, razor-sharp smile, you are now officially an accessory to money laundering for a recognized transnational criminal organization. I hope you charge a very high retainer, Mr. Vance. You are going to need it for your own defense attorney. The silver-suited lawyer stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. He looked down at the documents in his hands, suddenly treating them like they were coated in toxic waste. He took a slow, deliberate step away from DeAndre. Thomas leaned heavily against the wall, his breathing ragged. Brenda was completely silent, staring at me as if I were a stranger. They had come here to bully me, to use the weight of family obligation and legal threats to force my submission. They had completely failed to realize that I had spent my entire adult life preparing for this exact battle. I slowly stood up from my leather chair, smoothing my jacket. I looked down at the yellowed piece of paper Vance had thrown on my desk. I reached out and picked it up by the corner. I looked directly at my father, who was watching me with wide, terrified eyes. I offered him a chilling, absolute smile. Your power of attorney is from when I was 18, I said, dropping the worthless paper into the trash can next to my desk. It is cute. But let me show you what I did on my 30th birthday. The silence in my office was absolute, broken only by the hum of the central air conditioning and the ragged, panicked breathing of my brother-in-law. I turned my back on my family for a brief moment, stepping toward the heavy steel safe concealed behind the abstract painting on my back wall. I spun the dial, the metallic clicks echoing sharply against the glass. I pulled open the heavy door and retrieved a thick, genuine leather folder. It was bound with a thick cord and sealed with a heavy imprint of crimson wax. The insignia of our firm's private wealth management division was pressed clearly into the seal. I walked back to my desk and dropped the folder right next to DeAndre's fraudulent county deed. The heavy thud made Thomas jump. My 30th birthday was a milestone you all conveniently forgot, I said, looking directly at my mother. You were too busy organizing Brittany's extravagant baby shower to send so much as a text message. But I did not mind. While you were booking ice sculptures and hiring classical harpists with stolen money, I was sitting in this exact office with David finalizing my future. I broke the wax seal with a sharp, satisfying snap. I pulled out a stack of crisp, watermarked legal documents and spread them across the polished mahogany surface. This is the Theodore Heritage Trust. I explained, my voice echoing with absolute authority. It is a blind, irrevocable trust. Do you know what the word irrevocable means in the context of federal asset protection, Thomas? My father stared at the papers, his face draining of whatever color it had left. He shook his head slightly, completely out of his depth. Marcus Vance, however, understood immediately. The sleazy lawyer took another step back toward the door, his eyes wide with professional terror. It means the transfer cannot be undone, I stated, answering my own question. 2 years ago, I transferred the sole deed of my grandfather's downtown Austin building directly into this trust. I relinquished my personal individual ownership of the property. I placed it under the protective umbrella of a corporate entity governed by a strict board of trustees. David is the primary executor. I am merely the primary beneficiary. I picked up the stamped county deed DeAndre had slammed onto my desk just minutes ago. I held it up to the morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Let us look closely at your paperwork, DeAndre, I instructed. Let us look at the seller signature line. Thomas signed his name as my proxy. He used a defunct 18-year-old power of attorney to sell a commercial asset on behalf of Alyssa Wilson, the individual citizen. I dropped the fake deed onto the floor. It fluttered down, landing on the toe of DeAndre's expensive Italian loafer. Alyssa Wilson does not own that building, I continued, leaning over my desk. Alyssa Wilson has not owned that building for 24 months. The Theodore Heritage Trust owns that building. Therefore, a personal power of attorney is completely legally irrelevant. You cannot sell an asset that your proxy target does not possess. Brenda gripped the edge of my desk, her knuckles turning white. What are you saying? She demanded, her voice barely a whisper. Speak English, Alyssa. I will make it exceptionally simple for you, Mother, I said, turning my cold gaze to her. You and Dad went to the county clerk. You presented old documents. You swore under penalty of perjury that you had the legal right to liquidate an asset. You signed official government transfer documents claiming ownership of a multi-million-dollar commercial lot. You bypassed standard title insurance checks by bribing a clerk to expedite the filing. You relied on an outdated understanding of wealth, Dad, I said, cutting through my father's rising panic. You assumed that because you controlled the checkbook when I was a teenager, you would always hold the keys to my life. You thought a simple piece of paper signed by a naive 18-year-old girl would forever trump a team of corporate lawyers. You never bothered to learn how actual generational wealth is protected. You just knew how to spend it. Vance violently shoved his legal briefcase into his armpit, practically vibrating with the need to flee. I am formally withdrawing my representation of this client. Vance blurted out, his slick demeanor entirely vanished. I had no knowledge of a prior trust assignment. I was operating under fraudulent pretenses provided by the seller. He did not wait for a single response. Vance bolted out the glass door, sprinting down the hallway toward the elevators as if the building were on fire. David finally stepped fully into my office, shutting the glass door behind him. He looked at my parents with the detached gaze of a predator observing cornered prey. He picked up the trust documents, verifying the seals and signatures before placing them safely back into the leather folder. Your lawyer is a rat, but he is a smart rat, David remarked dryly. He knows exactly what happens next. DeAndre fell into the guest chair, burying his face in his hands. A low, pathetic moan escaped his throat. The reality of his situation was finally crushing him under its absolute weight. He had thought he was a mastermind, a slick operator who could outmaneuver a quiet accountant. He had wildly underestimated the battlefield. I looked down at the documents, then back up at my family. The arrogance that had defined their entire existence was completely gone, stripped away by the brutal mechanics of financial law. I rested my hands flat on my desk and delivered the killing blow. Because the building was in a trust, the deed you signed yesterday is legally fraudulent. Thomas, Brenda, you did not sell a building. You committed title fraud. And DeAndre, you just accepted $1 million for a property you do not own. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Thomas gripped his chest, struggling to breathe. Brenda was frozen, staring at me with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The money is already gone, DeAndre whispered into his hands, his voice cracking with pure despair. The cartel syndicate wired the deposit and I routed it immediately to my creditors. I cannot get it back. I cannot refund them. Then you have a very serious logistical problem, I replied, sitting back in my chair. Because tomorrow morning, an organization known for extreme physical violence is going to realize they just paid $1 million for a fake piece of paper. And they are not going to file a civil lawsuit, DeAndre. They are going to send people to collect. Thomas's face transitioned from a sickly pale to a dangerous mottled crimson. He stepped toward DeAndre, his hands balling into tight fists at his sides. The reality of his own severe legal exposure had finally pierced through his decades of arrogant entitlement. You told me you had a legitimate buyer, Thomas roared, the sound bouncing harshly off the glass walls of my office. You stood in my living room and swore to me that this was a standard high-end syndication deal. You never mentioned a shell company, and you certainly never mentioned a cartel, you incompetent fool. You involved me in international money laundering. DeAndre shoved Thomas backward, his own rising panic morphing into vicious cornered defensiveness. Do not try to pin this entirely on me, Thomas. DeAndre spat, his chest heaving. You are the one who brought me that useless piece of paper. You sat in my office, drank my expensive scotch, and guaranteed me that the power of attorney was absolutely bulletproof. You swore Alyssa had no legal recourse and that we could bypass the standard title insurance delays. You handed me the matches, and now you are complaining about the fire. Brenda wedged herself between the two men, her heavy diamond bracelets clanking against their chests as she pushed them apart. Stop it, she shrieked, her voice cracking under the immense strain. Both of you stop right now. We are a family. We just need to figure out how to force her to transfer the deed properly before this gets out of hand. I sat perfectly still, resting my chin on my steepled fingers, and observed the spectacular implosion of their unholy alliance. There is a distinct fascinating moment in fraud investigations when co-conspirators realize the ship is actively sinking beneath their feet. The fierce loyalty they pretended to share instantly evaporates, replaced by a desperate animalistic instinct to use each other as human shields. Before Brenda could attempt to negotiate her way out of a federal wire fraud conspiracy, the heavy glass door to my office was shoved open once again. Brittany stood in the threshold, her designer maternity dress clinging tightly to her swollen belly. Her face was streaked with perfectly applied waterproof mascara, tears her lower lip trembling in a practiced display of distress. She must have received a panicked, incoherent text message from Brenda the moment David mentioned the district attorney. Alyssa, what are you doing? Brittany wailed, rushing into the room and immediately clinging to DeAndre's arm. Mom texted me that you are trying to steal DeAndre's building and ruin his business deal. How could you be so entirely selfish? I did not even blink. It is my building, Brittany, and DeAndre does not have a business deal. He has a very serious debt collection problem with a transnational criminal syndicate. Brittany let out a loud, dramatic sob, pressing a manicured hand to her forehead as if she were on the verge of collapsing. She leaned heavily against DeAndre, looking at me with wide, pleading eyes. You have to fix this right now, Alyssa, she cried, her voice reaching a shrill, hysterical pitch that grated against my ears. You are deliberately trying to destroy my marriage. I am 6 months pregnant. The doctor explicitly said I cannot have any stress. If anything happens to this baby because you are throwing a jealous tantrum over a stupid piece of real estate, it will be entirely your fault. I leaned back in my leather chair, completely immune to the performance. You have played the fragile, victimized card for 30 years, Brittany. I said, my voice cutting through her theatrical sobbing like a surgical blade. You used those exact same tears when you totaled my car in high school and convinced Dad I was the one driving so you would not lose your allowance. You used that exact same manufactured panic when you convinced Mom to drain my college savings account to fund your first failed clothing boutique. Brittany's fake sobs hitched in her throat, her eyes flashing with a sudden venomous glare. You weaponize your fragility to avoid accountability, but it does not work on me anymore, I continued coldly. I do not care if you are pregnant, Brittany. Biology does not grant you immunity from the federal consequences of your husband's fraud. You married a grifter because he bought you expensive bags and funded your country club lifestyle, and now the bill is due. Brittany gasped, turning frantically toward our father for her usual rescue. Dad, make her stop. Make her sign the papers. Fix this. But Thomas was not looking at Brittany. He was staring at the floor, his breathing shallow and rapid, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. For the first time in his life, he had encountered a problem that could not be solved by screaming, throwing money, or blaming me. DeAndre began pacing the narrow strip of carpet between my desk and the door, pulling frantically at his hair. We just need a bridge loan, he muttered to himself, his eyes wide and unfocused. Thomas, you can liquidate your retirement accounts. If we just return the principal today, they will walk away. We just need $1 million in cash right now. I do not have $1 million. Thomas barked, his voice laced with pure, unadulterated terror. I do not even have half of that. Brenda and I are leveraged to the hilt paying for Brittany's lifestyle. Suddenly, a sharp, violent, buzzing vibration interrupted the heavy breathing in the room, Everyone froze. The sound was coming from the inside pocket of DeAndre's suit jacket. He slowly reached inside and pulled out a sleek black burner phone. The screen was illuminated in the dim light, displaying a restricted international number. DeAndre stared at the glowing screen, as if it were a live grenade. His thumb hovered over the red reject button, his hand shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device onto the floor. "Answer it, DeAndre," I commanded softly, the absolute authority in my tone, leaving him no room to argue. Ignoring them will only accelerate their timeline. He swallowed hard, a visible gulp of terror, and pressed the green button. He did not bring the phone to his ear. Instead, his trembling fingers activated the speakerphone, and he dropped the device onto the polished wood of my desk. The voice that echoed through my office was incredibly calm, entirely devoid of anger, and completely terrifying. It was the voice of a man who viewed human life as a simple, disposable ledger entry. "Mr. Davis," the voice stated smoothly, cutting through the absolute silence of the room. "We have received notification from our internal auditors that the property deed you provided as collateral has been flagged as legally fraudulent. We do not tolerate bad faith transactions within our organization." DeAndre leaned over the desk, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. "I can fix it. There was a clerical error with the county filing. I just need a little more time to clear the title." "Time is not the currency we deal in," the voice replied, the tone dropping several degrees colder. "You have until midnight tonight to wire the full $1 million principal back to our primary routing account. If the funds are not cleared by exactly 12 a.m., we will consider the contract permanently breached. At that point, we will no longer be interested in your real estate. We will come to collect your physical assets instead." The line went dead, leaving a harsh dial tone echoing in the sterile office. The harsh, rhythmic dial tone of the burner phone blared through my office, acting as the starting bell for the sheer panic that immediately swallowed the room. DeAndre stared at the black device on my desk, as if a venomous snake had just coiled itself next to his hand. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of a filing cabinet, and sliding down the wall until he hit the floor. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. Thomas was clutching his chest, his eyes darting frantically toward the door, clearly calculating if he could make it to his car before the cartel assassins arrived in the lobby. Brittany had completely abandoned her previous outrage. Her hands shielded her face as she backed into the furthest corner of the office, trembling uncontrollably. The illusion of their invincibility had evaporated in less than 60 seconds. They were no longer the arrogant elites demanding compliance. They were trapped, terrified, and out of time. Brenda watched the absolute terror paralyze her golden son-in-law and her favored daughter. She slowly turned her head to look at me. The venom and superiority that usually hardened her features melted away, replaced by an entirely new strategy. I recognized the shift instantly. When intimidation failed, my mother always resorted to the one weapon she believed was universally effective. Tears welled up in Brenda's eyes, spilling over her perfectly powdered cheeks. Her shoulders slumped, transforming her from a commanding matriarch into a fragile, desperate old woman. She took a slow, trembling step toward my desk, reaching out with shaking hands. "Alyssa, my sweet girl." Brenda sobbed, her voice cracking with a manufactured devastation that would have won her a daytime television award. "Please, you have to listen to me. You have to help us. You are the only one who can fix this disaster. We are your family." She grabbed the edge of my desk, leaning her weight against the polished mahogany as if she could no longer stand on her own. "I am your mother, Alyssa," she pleaded, her tears landing in heavy drops on the glass surface. "I gave you life. I carried you in my body for 9 brutal months. I endured 30 hours of agonizing labor to bring you into this world. I wiped your tears when you were a little girl. You are my flesh and blood. You owe this family your loyalty. You cannot just sit there and let these violent people murder DeAndre or put your father in a federal prison. You have to dissolve that trust and give them the building." I did not offer her a tissue. I did not reach out to comfort her. I remained perfectly still, watching her theatrical breakdown with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. Loyalty. I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue as if it were a foreign concept. You want to invoke the sacred bond of motherhood to save a grifter from a cartel. That is a fascinating strategy, Mother. Let us talk about your maternal loyalty. Let us talk about the winter I turned 22. Brenda's sobs hitched in her throat. Her eyes darted back and forth silently begging me not to pull the skeletons out of our family closet in front of an audience. I ignored her silent plea. I had bilateral pneumonia, I stated, my voice echoing clearly against the glass walls. My lungs were filling with fluid. I was running a fever of 104 degrees. I drove myself to the emergency room because I could barely breathe. The triage nurse admitted me straight to the intensive care unit. I was terrified. I called you from my hospital bed begging you to come sit with me because the doctors were discussing putting me on a ventilator. Thomas looked away suddenly, finding the pattern of the carpet fascinating. Brittany kept her face hidden in her hands. Do you remember where you were, Mother? I asked, leaning slightly forward. Do you remember what you told me when your daughter was lying in a hospital bed, suffocating? Brenda opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her tears flowed faster, but the manipulative edge had vanished, replaced by genuine cornered shame. You told me to stop being dramatic and ask a nurse for some cough syrup, I said, delivering the memory with absolute freezing precision. You told me that you and Brittany were at an exclusive invite-only spa retreat in Sedona. You said the mud baths were entirely non-refundable, and you simply could not disrupt your relaxation schedule just because I caught a winter cold. I spent 4 days in the intensive care unit completely alone. I watched other patients receive flowers, balloons, and visitors while I stared at a blank wall listening to the heart monitors. Alyssa. I did not understand how serious it was. Brenda cried out, reaching across the desk to grab my sleeve. I swear to you, if I had known it was life-threatening, I would have been on the first plane back to Texas. I am so sorry. Please, I am begging you. Do not let my mistakes condemn this entire family. DeAndre will be killed. You have the power to stop this. Just dissolve the trust. Sign the papers and give us the deed. I will do anything you want. She fell to her knees, her designer dress pooling around her on the floor. She clasped her hands together in a prayerful gesture, weeping loudly. It was the ultimate display of submission, a desperate gamble to crack my resolve. I looked down at the woman who had spent 3 decades making me feel entirely invisible and fundamentally worthless. I felt absolutely nothing. The well of my empathy had dried up years ago, drained by a lifetime of their casual cruelty. You did not care if I stopped breathing when I was 22? I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet loud enough to command the room. And I do not care if your son-in-law stops breathing tonight. Your tears mean nothing to me. They are just another currency you are trying to spend because your bank accounts are empty. Brenda wailed, burying her face in the side of my desk. Thomas finally moved, stepping forward to pull his wife off the floor. Alyssa, please. Thomas begged, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance. We will give you anything. I will sign over my entire remaining estate to you. I will publicly apologize. Just undo the trust. Give us the building back so we can survive this day. I stood up, towering over my broken parents. I gathered the wax-sealed documents, neatly tapping the edges against the desktop to align the pages. I cannot dissolve the trust even if I wanted to, I announced, dropping the heavy folder back onto the center of the desk. An irrevocable trust requires absolute consensus to dissolve. My signature alone is entirely legally meaningless. The federal charter explicitly mandates that any alteration, dissolution, or transfer of the primary asset must be formally authorized and signed by the assigned co-trustee. DeAndre scrambled up from the floor, his eyes wild with a sudden desperate hope. Who is it? He shouted, wiping the sweat from his eyes. Who is the co-trustee? We can pay them off. We can offer them a percentage of the sale. Tell me who it is. Right on cue, the heavy oak door at the end of the suite swung open with a resounding click. The steady, measured sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing louder as the figure approached my office. I watched the blood drain entirely from my father's face as the man stepped through the glass doorway. The heavy oak door swung open with a slow, deliberate creak that silenced the entire room. The frantic pacing, the hysterical sobbing, the desperate pleas all ceased instantly. Stepping through the threshold was Silas Sterling. At 72 years old, Silas moved with the predatory grace of a man who had spent 5 decades dismantling rival corporations for sport. He wore a charcoal bespoke three-piece suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, his piercing gray eyes locking onto my father with an expression of unadulterated contempt. Silas was not just a senior partner at the most ruthless law firm in Texas. He had been my grandfather Theodore's closest friend, his primary legal counsel, and his original business partner. Thomas staggered backward, knocking over a stack of legal volumes on his way down. Silas, he choked out the remaining blood draining from his face. "What are you doing here?" Silas did not acknowledge my father. He walked past DeAndre, ignoring him entirely, and approached my desk. He offered me a brief, respectful nod. "You handled the initial assault perfectly, Alyssa," Silas said, his deep baritone voice resonating through the office. "Theodore would be immensely proud of your composure today." I gestured to the open leather folder on my desk. They were under the distinct impression that my signature alone could liquidate the trust, Silas. I believe they need a harsh lesson in corporate governance. Silas slowly turned to face my father. Thomas gripped the back of a leather chair to keep his knees from buckling. Brenda had stopped her theatrical crying, staring up at the imposing attorney with genuine dread. "You always were a remarkably slow learner." Thomas Silas began buttoning his suit jacket. "Did you honestly believe Theodore would leave a multi-million-dollar commercial asset unprotected in the hands of a 20-something girl, knowing full well you would circle like a vulture the second you needed cash? Your father knew exactly what kind of financial parasite you were. He knew you would eventually try to cannibalize her inheritance to cover your own catastrophic mistakes." "That is my father you are talking about?" Thomas stammered, attempting to summon a shred of dignity. "He trusted me to manage this family." "He trusted you to ruin it," Silas corrected sharply. "And you have exceeded his darkest expectations." When Theodore drafted his final will, he came to my office. We spent 3 weeks building a legal fortress around Alyssa. We established the Theodore Heritage Trust with me as the irrevocable co-trustee. The mandate was simple. The asset could only be leveraged, sold, or altered if both Alyssa and I agreed it was in the long-term strategic interest of the portfolio. Silas stepped closer to Thomas, towering over him. "Funding a cartel bridge loan for your grifter son-in-law does not meet our fiduciary standard, Thomas." DeAndre let out a strangled gasp from the corner, but Silas did not even look his way. Instead, the older man reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a thick, sealed envelope. The paper was slightly yellowed, bearing my grandfather's personal monogram. "Theodore left a series of directives to be opened only if you attempted to subvert the trust," Silas explained, his eyes fixed on Brenda and Thomas. "I opened this particular letter yesterday morning when my fraud division flagged your fraudulent deed transfer at the county clerk's office. I think you need to hear exactly what your father thought of you." Silas broke the seal and unfolded the heavy parchment. He read the words with brutal, precise articulation. "To my son Thomas and his wife Brenda," Silas read aloud. "If Silas is reading this to you, it means you have finally crossed the line from incompetent parents to active predators. For 30 years, I watched you coddle Brittany, shielding her from every consequence and turning her into a fragile, useless vanity project. I watched you enable DeAndre's obvious financial delusions because you cared more about country club appearances than actual fiscal solvency. But worst of all, I watched you systematically punish Alyssa for being the only person in this family with a spine." Brenda let out a sharp cry, covering her mouth with both hands. Brittany sank to the floor, her eyes wide with shock. "You called Alyssa a disappointment because she chose hard work over your shallow social climbing." Silas continued, reading, his voice unwavering. "You treated her like a scapegoat because her independence threatened your control. But Alyssa is the only one who inherited my vision. She is the only true heir to the empire I built. You thought you could strip her of her assets to save yourselves. You thought wrong. I built this trust to break your teeth the moment you tried to bite her." Silas folded the letter with a crisp snap and placed it on my desk. He looked at my parents, who were now completely broken, stripped of the delusions they had clung to for decades. The validation washed over me like ice water. Every stolen birthday, every dismissed achievement, every cruel comparison to my sister. My grandfather had seen it all. He had known the truth, and he had reached out from the grave to shield me. "That is not fair," Brenda whispered, her voice trembling. "We did our best. We loved all our children." "You loved yourselves," Brenda, Silas stated coldly, "and you loved the comfortable lies you spun. But the truth has a very steep price of admission, and the bill has just arrived." Silas reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick-bound legal manifesto. He did not hand it to my mother. He walked directly up to Thomas and slammed the heavy stack of papers squarely into my father's chest. Thomas fumbled, catching the documents awkwardly against his ribs. "What is this?" Thomas choked out, staring at the bold red print on the cover sheet. "That is your final consequence," Silas said, his eyes narrowing. "When you went to the county clerk yesterday, you did not just forge a power of attorney. You utilized the original corporate seal of the Wilson Family Holding Company to bypass the title insurance waiting period. You used a registered corporate entity to commit federal wire fraud." Thomas stopped breathing entirely. The papers shook violently in his grip. "As the senior legal counsel for the holding company board, I called an emergency session at 6 o'clock this morning," Silas explained, relishing every single syllable. "The vote was unanimous. By utilizing the corporate seal in a felony fraud conspiracy, you have violated the primary morality clause of the corporate bylaws." Silas leaned in, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet register. "By the way, Thomas, since you committed fraud using Theodore's original corporate seal, the board is officially ousting you as CEO of the family holding company. You are terminated effective immediately. Your corporate accounts are frozen. Your access to the family wealth is permanently revoked. You have absolutely nothing left." The heavy silence left in the wake of Silas's declaration was broken by the sound of Brittany taking a frantic, staggering step backward. She dropped DeAndre's arm as if his expensive tailored suit had suddenly caught fire. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this," Brittany cried out, her voice echoing sharply off the glass walls of my office. She pressed her hands against her pregnant stomach, looking frantically between Silas, our parents, and finally me. "You all know I do not handle the finances. DeAndre handles the business. Dad handles the investments. I am just trying to raise a family. I am completely innocent here." DeAndre looked at his wife with sheer, unadulterated disbelief. The man was facing the wrath of a criminal syndicate, and his own wife was shoving him directly into their path to save herself. "Brittany, are you kidding me right now?" DeAndre shouted, his voice cracking with raw hysteria. "You are the one who told me to push the deal through. You said your father would rubber stamp the paperwork. You told me we needed the cash to maintain our image." "Do not insult my intelligence, Brittany," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that immediately commanded the room. "You seem to continually forget what I actually do for a living. I am not just a standard accountant. My specialty is forensic financial tracking. When I saw the fraudulent county deed hit the system yesterday, I did not just look at DeAndre's accounts, I looked at yours." I turned my computer monitor around to face the room. The wide screen displayed a complex, undeniable web of banking transfers highlighted in glaring red and yellow. "You claim you do not handle the finances." I continued, stepping around my desk to stand directly in front of my sister. "Yet your personal signature is on the secondary loan documents that initiated this entire catastrophic cascade." I directed my gaze to my parents, who were still reeling from their own corporate excommunication. DeAndre's Ponzi scheme started collapsing 14 months ago. He needed capital to pay off early investors so they would not go to the authorities. The cartel loan was a recent act of pure desperation. Before he turned to international money launderers, he turned to his wife. And Brittany turned to the one asset she had unrestricted access to. I picked up a thick, stapled contract from my desk drawer and tossed it onto the glass coffee table. Dad, Mom, I said, locking eyes with my father. You gave Brittany unrestricted access to your personal estate accounts when you made her the manager of your retirement portfolio. You told everyone at the country club that she needed practical experience. You said she had a brilliant mind for modern investments. You handed her the keys to your entire financial future because you could not bear to tell your golden child no. Thomas let out a shaky breath, staring at the thick contract on the table. What did she do, Alyssa? Brittany did not invest your money, I stated brutally. She spent it. When the liquid cash ran out 6 months ago, she took out a secondary mortgage on your retirement estate in Naples. She forged your signature, Mom. She bribed a notary to authenticate the documents. She leveraged the entire equity of your home to keep DeAndre out of a federal penitentiary and to continue funding her own fake manufactured lifestyle. Brittany backed further into the corner, shaking her head aggressively, but her silence was a deafening confession. Did you ever wonder how she afforded those weekly designer clothing hauls on her social media? I demanded, stepping closer to my parents. How she paid for the luxury vacations she posted about to her bot followers. She was burning your retirement to the ground. She drained every single account, maxed out the equity on your estate, and funneled the cash directly into DeAndre's failing shell companies. Silas stepped forward, his imposing figure adding devastating legal weight to my revelation. My office conducted a quiet review of those transactions this morning, Thomas Silas said, his voice completely devoid of pity. Brittany committed identity theft and bank fraud. She used your personal credentials to secure high-interest predatory loans. Thomas let out a guttural, choked gasp. He stumbled toward the monitor, his eyes tracking the highlighted red lines that showed his life savings evaporating into offshore accounts and luxury retail purchases. His chest heaved as the undeniable proof stared back at him. Brittany, tell me she is lying. Thomas begged, his voice cracking with a terrifying fragility. Tell me my home is safe. Tell me you did not steal our future. Brittany refused to meet his eyes. She stared at the floor, her lip quivering. I deserve that money, she muttered bitterly. You always said it would be mine eventually. I just needed an advance to help my husband. Your home is gone, Dad, I said, delivering the absolute truth with zero hesitation. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on the Naples property yesterday morning. You are no longer the CEO of the family holding company. Your corporate accounts are frozen. Your personal accounts are completely drained. The golden child you protected and enabled your entire life has left you completely and utterly destitute. Brenda let out a sound that was half shriek, half wail. It was a raw, primal noise of absolute devastation. The reality of losing her social standing, her wealth, her home, and her entire identity broke her instantly. The carefully constructed facade of superiority she had worn for 3 decades shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her knees gave out and she collapsed violently onto the floor, her hands tearing at her own hair as she wept uncontrollably. Thomas dropped to his knees beside his weeping wife, his hands hovering over her trembling shoulders, completely powerless to fix the ruin his own favoritism had created. Just as the sheer magnitude of their destruction settled over the room, my computer chimed with a sharp, high-pitched alert. I glanced down at my phone, which was securely synced to the international banking system. A stark, unyielding notification flashed across the digital screen. I picked up the device and read the words aloud, my voice echoing like a final gavel strike in the silent office. The wire transfer reversal has been denied by the Federal Reserve, I announced. The funds are flagged under international anti-money laundering statutes. The money is permanently locked. I slowly raised my eyes and looked directly at DeAndre. He had gone completely rigid, his skin taking on a waxy, translucent pallor. Your money is gone, DeAndre, I said, offering him no solace, no escape, and absolutely no mercy. And midnight is coming very fast. DeAndre stared at me, his eyes dilated with raw, primal panic. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by Brenda's muffled whimpering on the floor and Thomas's shallow, ragged breathing. The reality of the frozen Federal Reserve wire meant DeAndre had no money, no leverage, and absolutely no way to appease the cartel before the midnight deadline. A trapped rat will chew off its own leg to escape, and DeAndre was entirely out of options. He did not run for the elevator. He did not run for the stairs. He spun around his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping on the polished hardwood and sprinted straight for the adjoining glass-walled conference room. It was the nerve center of my firm housing the primary server terminal where I conducted all my forensic financial tracking. It held every digitized ledger, every offshore routing number, and every encrypted shell company contract he had ever touched. He threw his weight against the heavy glass door, shoving it open and hurling himself into the ergonomic chair at the head of the long table. His hands slammed onto the keyboard. Through the soundproof glass, I could hear the frantic, heavy clacking of the keys. His face was slick with sweat, his tie askew, his breathing visible in sharp, panicked gasps. He was desperately trying to bypass my network security, hunting for the digital footprints of his fake syndicate to wipe the servers clean before the federal authorities or the cartel's auditors could seize them. I did not rush to stop him. I simply picked up my tablet from my desk and strolled toward the glass wall, watching his clumsy, frantic keystrokes with profound amusement. It was a pathetic display of technical incompetence. This was the exact same man who loved to belittle my entire profession at every single family gathering. I vividly remembered our 4th of July barbecue 3 years ago. DeAndre had stood by the grill, a craft beer in his hand, holding court with Thomas and a group of local real estate developers. He had pointed his stainless steel tongs at me across the patio and loudly declared that I was just a glorified IT girl who played with spreadsheets all day. He boasted that technology was for the worker bees, while visionaries like him operated on pure instinct charm and high-stakes handshakes. He loved to remind my parents that forensic accounting was a dead-end career for people without the courage to make real moves. Now the great visionary was hyperventilating, mashing the backspace key as if brute force could somehow rewrite federal banking logs. Silas stepped up beside me, his hands clasped firmly behind his back, observing the spectacle with cold, predatory stillness. Thomas had finally managed to pull Brenda off the floor, but they were both frozen in my office doorway, watching their golden son-in-law completely unravel. Brittany remained pressed against the wall, entirely useless, her hands covering her mouth as she watched her husband attempt to hack a federally secured terminal. DeAndre reached into his suit pocket and produced a small black flash drive. It was likely a basic off-the-shelf malware wiping script he had purchased on the dark web for emergencies. He jammed it blindly into the terminal tower. His eyes darted around the massive monitors, hunting for the primary directories I had just displayed in my office. He was clicking wildly, opening folders, closing prompts, leaving a trail of unauthorized access attempts so loud it would alert a first-year IT student. I stood perfectly still, my thumb hovering over the sleek glass of my tablet. DeAndre's face suddenly lit up. Through the transparent wall, I watched the reflection of a bright blue progress bar appear on his screen. He had located a master folder labeled Syndicate Routing Ledgers. He dragged the massive file into his wiping program and hit execute with a heavy, desperate strike of the enter key. The progress bar zipped from 0 to 100% in a matter of seconds. A large green confirmation prompt flashed across the dual monitors. DeAndre leaped out of the chair, throwing his arms in the air. He let out a loud, guttural cheer of absolute victory, kicking the chair away as he turned toward the glass wall to look at me. His chest heaved violently, a manic, triumphant grin stretching across his sweaty, flushed face. He genuinely believed he had just destroyed the only evidence linking him to the international money laundering operation. He pointed a shaking, arrogant finger at me, mouthing the words, "It is gone." I did not blink. I tapped the center of my tablet screen once. The electronic locks on the conference room doors clicked open with a sharp, synchronized snap. I stepped into the room, my voice cutting through his premature celebration like a surgical blade. "You didn't delete the files, DeAndre," I stated with absolute terrifying calm. "You just forwarded them directly to FinCEN." DeAndre stared at the glowing monitors, his brain struggling to process the words I had just spoken. FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving him looking like a ghost trapped in an expensive sweat-soaked suit. He lunged at the keyboard again, his fingers slamming against the keys in a futile, erratic frenzy, desperately searching for an undo command that did not exist in the architecture of federal reporting. I leaned against the glass frame of the door, crossing my arms. You really thought I kept the actual syndicate routing ledgers in a basic unsecured desktop folder labeled with a neon sign? I asked, my voice echoing in the sterile room. That was a honeypot, DeAndre. A decoy directory specifically designed for an unauthorized user. The moment your black market malware attempted to compress and delete those files, my network enacted an automated fail-safe protocol. You did not wipe anything. You authorized a direct encrypted data packet transfer to the Treasury Department. DeAndre grabbed his own hair, pulling hard enough to rip it from his scalp. You killed me! He screamed, his voice breaking into a high-pitched wail. The cartel is going to skin me alive! They are going to murder us all! They are not going to get the chance, I replied smoothly. Let me break down exactly the level of federal exposure you just subjected yourself to. You violated Title 18 United States Code, Section 1343. Wire fraud. You initiated electronic transfers from a fraudulent Delaware shell corporation to a routing server in Nevada. The moment those digital funds crossed state lines, you triggered automatic federal jurisdiction. But you did not stop there. You layered it with violations of Section 1956. Money laundering. You took illicit cartel capital, disguised it as legitimate real estate bridge loans, and funneled it through Thomas and Brenda's personal retirement accounts. Silas stepped into the conference room, his heavy shoes clicking sharply against the tile floor. He looked at DeAndre with an expression of profound disgust. You left a digital footprint so wide and so clumsy that a first-year law student could prosecute this case, Silas added. You handed the federal government a perfectly wrapped bow of international racketeering evidence, complete with your own IP address stamping the final delivery. Behind us, a sudden sharp movement drew my attention. Thomas had abandoned his weeping wife on the floor. He marched toward the glass conference room, his face flushed with a terrifying, desperate rage. He pushed past Silas, marching directly into my personal space. His fists were balled tightly at his sides, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of the patriarchal dominance he had wielded like a club my entire life. You listen to me right now, you ungrateful, vindictive little girl, Thomas barked, spit flying from his lips. You are going to call whoever you just sent those files to and tell them it was a mistake. You are going to fix this. If you do not reverse this right this second, you are done. I will disown you. I will strike your name from every family record. I will make sure you never see a single dime of the Wilson wealth. You will be dead to me, Alyssa. Dead and completely cut off. The silence that followed his tirade was absolute. DeAndre was whimpering in the corner. Brenda was weeping in the other room. Brittany was completely catatonic. I looked at my father. I looked at his shaking hands, his sweat-stained collar, his desperate, bulging eyes. And then I laughed. It was not a forced laugh, nor a nervous chuckle. It was a loud, genuine release of tension. I threw my head back and laughed at the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of the man standing in front of me. Thomas stepped back, completely thrown off balance by my reaction. What is so funny? He demanded, his voice wavering. You have zero leverage, Dad, I said, wiping a tear of mirth from my eye. You are threatening to cut me out of the Wilson wealth. What wealth? Your bank accounts are frozen. Your corporate holding company has ousted you. Brittany drained the equity out of your retirement estate. You do not have a dime to your name. You are entirely broke. Thomas opened his mouth, but the words died in his throat. For 30 years, you used your money as a weapon. I continued, my laughter fading into a cold, hard stare. You used it to control Mom. You used it to spoil Brittany into a state of absolute dependency. You used it to fund DeAndre's scams so you could pretend you had a successful business prodigy for a son-in-law. And you used it to threaten me every time I showed an ounce of independence. But your weapon is gone, Thomas. You cannot disown me because I own everything. The building is mine. The trust is intact. You have absolutely nothing left to threaten me with. Thomas deflated. The rigid, arrogant posture completely collapsed. He suddenly looked like a very old, very tired, very frightened man. He slumped against the glass wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor next to DeAndre, staring blankly at the ceiling. the great patriarch of the Wilson family reduced to a hollow shell. Silas walked over to the large floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the busy downtown street below. He pulled back the heavy blinds, his gray eyes scanning the pavement. "Alyssa," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, serious murmur. "I believe your guests have arrived." I turned away from my ruined family and walked over to the window. Down on the street, the normal flow of midday traffic had been completely blocked off. Three massive matte black SUVs with heavily tinted windows screeched to a halt directly in front of the main entrance to the accounting firm. The doors of the vehicles swung open in perfect unison. A dozen men and women stepped out onto the pavement. They moved with military precision, their faces stern and focused. They were wearing dark tactical gear, heavy utility belts, and navy blue windbreakers. Across the back of their jackets, bright, bold yellow letters spelled out the acronyms of their respective agencies: FBI, IRS, FinCEN. They did not pause to speak to the building's security guards. They bypassed the front desk entirely, moving in a coordinated formation straight toward the elevator banks. The chime of the elevator arrival bell echoed through the silent reception area of my firm. It was immediately followed by the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots marching across the polished hardwood floor. Through the transparent glass walls of the conference room, I watched as the double doors of my office suite were pushed open. A dozen federal agents flooded the space. They moved with a terrifying quiet efficiency, securing the perimeter and locking down the exits. There was no shouting, no dramatic television theatrics, just the absolute crushing weight of the United States government descending upon my family. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with iron gray hair and a stark FBI emblazoned across his navy windbreaker, approached my office. Silas stepped out to meet him, extending a hand and speaking in a low, professional murmur. The agent nodded, his steely gaze sweeping past Silas and locking directly onto the terrified figures cowering inside the glass walls. He pushed the conference room door open, and the air in the room seemed to vanish instantly. "DeAndre Marcus," the agent stated, his voice a flat, uncompromising baritone. "Thomas Wilson, Brenda Wilson, you are all being placed under arrest. We have federal warrants for your apprehension on multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and international money laundering." DeAndre let out a strangled, high-pitched noise. He scrambled backward, hitting the edge of the conference table, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. He looked nothing like the suave, untouchable visionary who had mocked my career for years. He was just a terrified, broken criminal facing decades in a maximum security penitentiary. Thomas shoved himself off the floor, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple with a mixture of indignation and sheer panic. "Now see here," Thomas barked, pointing a trembling finger at the lead agent. "You have no right to barge in here. I am the CEO of Wilson Holding. I know the mayor. I play golf with the district attorney. You are making a catastrophic mistake, and I will have your badge for this." The agent did not even blink. He reached to his belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "The district attorney does not handle federal racketeering charges, Mr. Wilson," the agent replied smoothly, stepping toward my father. "And the mayor cannot save you from the IRS. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of the handcuffs closing around Thomas's wrists broke whatever fragile spell was keeping my mother quiet. Brenda snapped. But she did not react with fear or remorse. She reacted with the same staggering, arrogant entitlement she had wielded her entire life. She marched right up to the federal agents, waving her diamond-encrusted hands in the air. "Excuse me!" Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass. "What on earth do you think you are doing? You are scuffing the hardwood floors. Unhand my husband immediately. Alyssa, tell these people to leave." She turned to me, her eyes flashing with indignant fury, completely oblivious to the gravity of the federal raid occurring in my office. "Tell them there has been a misunderstanding," Brenda demanded. "Call the building manager. Do your job and fix this right now." I stared at her, my expression completely blank. It was a stunning display of delusion. Brenda was treating a squad of heavily armed federal agents like country club waitstaff who had brought her the wrong vintage of Chardonnay. For my entire life, she had expected me to quietly sweep up the messes my golden siblings and perfect father left behind. When I was 16, she forced me to take the blame when Brittany crashed the family sedan, telling the police I had left the parking brake off, so Brittany's perfect driving record would remain intact. When DeAndre's first startup hemorrhaged cash 5 years ago, Brenda demanded I spend my weekends untangling his chaotic tax returns for free, just to keep up the appearance of his financial genius. I was always the designated janitor for their mistakes, expected to absorb the damage while they took the credit. "I am not the manager, Mom," I said, my voice ice cold. "I am the federal informant." I took a deliberate step backward, offering her absolutely no protection as two female IRS agents moved in to secure her. "You built your entire social standing on stolen money and fraud." I continued, watching her face pale. "The bill has finally come due. I am not paying it for you." The agents moved with practiced precision. They secured DeAndre, next pressing him firmly against the glass wall to pat him down. He sobbed openly, his tears smearing the pristine glass, babbling incoherently about making a deal and giving them everything they wanted. Thomas was led out toward the elevators, his head bowed, the fight completely drained from his body as the reality of his total ruination finally set in. He was losing his freedom, his wealth, and his legacy all in the span of 5 minutes. When the agents grabbed Brenda's arm, she let out a piercing shriek. She thrashed and kicked her expensive designer heels, slipping on the floor. "You cannot do this to me," she wailed, her carefully styled hair falling into her face. "I host the hospital charity galas. You are ruining my reputation. Ma'am, stop resisting, or we will add assaulting a federal officer to your charges." One of the female agents snapped easily, subduing Brenda and clicking the handcuffs into place. Brenda let out a final, breathless sob as she was marched out of the room, her eyes locking onto mine one last time. There was no love in her gaze, only a deep, venomous betrayal that I met with an unwavering, stony stare. The room suddenly felt incredibly empty. Silas stood by the door, calmly reviewing a stack of digital warrants on his tablet. The lead agent finished coordinating the transport of the 3 prisoners over his shoulder radio. He paused, adjusting his tactical vest, and then slowly turned his attention to the far corner of the room. Brittany had not moved an inch since the raid began. She was pressed tightly against the wall, making herself as small as possible, desperately hoping the storm would pass over her. Her hands were still clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror so profound she seemed to have stopped breathing altogether. The lead agent stepped toward her, his heavy boots echoing in the now quiet conference room. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his inner jacket pocket and unfolded it with deliberate slowness. "Brittany Marcus," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Ma'am, we also have a warrant for your electronics regarding the fraudulent mortgage on the primary residence." Brittany flinched violently as the lead agent extended his hand. She did not argue or attempt to bargain. She practically shoved her diamond-encrusted smartphone and designer laptop bag into his chest, her hands trembling so fiercely that she dropped her car keys on the hardwood floor. Within an hour, the pristine glass walls of my office were entirely empty, leaving behind nothing but the lingering scent of my mother's expensive perfume and the harsh, undeniable reality of their ruin. Fast forward to the sterile, windowless observation room at the local FBI field office. I stood in the dark, a steaming cup of awful break-room coffee in my hand. I was not there as a suspect. I was there on an official federal consulting retainer for the Financial Crimes Division. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman named Agent Vance, stood beside me with her arms crossed as we stared through the two-way mirror. In the interrogation room on the other side of the glass, Brittany sat at a battered metal table. She looked completely out of place in her tailored silk blouse, shivering uncontrollably under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. 2 seasoned agents sat across from her, a mountain of my highlighted forensic ledgers stacked neatly between them. They did not even have to press her. They simply read her Miranda rights, and the golden child completely shattered. "It was not my fault," Brittany blurted out before the agents could even ask their first question. "DeAndre forced me to do it." He told me if I did not forge the mortgage documents, the men he borrowed money from would kill him. He manipulated me, and my father knew. Thomas knew everything from the very beginning. He told DeAndre to use the retirement accounts to hide the cartel transfers. They used me because my name was on the estate trust. I am a victim here. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching my sister systematically destroy the two men who had worshipped the ground she walked on. For 30 years, Thomas and Brenda had paraded Brittany around country club dinners and social galas, bragging about her fierce loyalty to the family. They had proudly proclaimed that she possessed the true Wilson heart while I was just the cold, calculating outcast. Yet here she was, less than 2 hours after her arrest, eagerly feeding her beloved parents to the federal wolves just to shave a few years off her own impending sentence. She did not stop there. Her voice rose to a frantic, hysterical pitch, echoing clearly through the speakers in our observation room. She leaned across the metal table, pointing a manicured finger at the financial ledgers. "Check the Cayman routing numbers," Brittany pleaded, her eyes wild with a feral desperation. DeAndre skimmed $200,000 off the top before he paid the early investors. He hid it in a shell company under my mother's maiden name. Brenda signed the formation papers. She is just as guilty as the rest of them. I am the only innocent one here. I only stayed married to him because my parents promised me control of the holding company. They are all criminals. Agent Vance let out a low whistle, shaking her head in sheer disbelief. "I have been prosecuting white-collar syndicates for 15 years, Vance murmured, keeping her eyes glued to the glass. "I have never seen a family turn on each other this fast. She is offering up wire fraud conspiracy charges on her own mother without us even floating a plea deal." "There is no loyalty among parasites," I replied smoothly, setting my coffee cup down on the control console. "But she is lying about the Cayman accounts. Pull up Ledger File 47 on your tablet, Agent Vance." Vance tapped her screen, bringing up the digital files I had forwarded earlier that morning. I pointed to a specific sequence of offshore transfers highlighted in stark yellow. "Brittany claims DeAndre skimmed that money and Brenda hid it," I explained, keeping my voice purely analytical and devoid of emotion. "But look at the timestamp on the shell company formation. It coincides exactly with a luxury real estate purchase in Monaco. A purchase signed exclusively by Brittany Marcus. She is trying to hand you her mother to cover up her own embezzlement of the cartel funds. She stole from the very men her husband was already stealing from." Vance smiled, a sharp, predatory grin. "You are incredibly good at this, Alyssa. You just saved my forensic team 3 weeks of digging." She pressed a button on the intercom console connecting to the agents in the interrogation room. "Press her on the Monaco property," Vance instructed through the microphone. "Tell her we have the deed." Through the glass, we watched the interrogating agents slide a new folder across the metal table. Brittany opened it, looked at the highlighted Monaco real estate deed, and physically deflated. The frantic, desperate energy drained out of her in an instant, replaced by a hollow, terrified silence. The golden child had finally run out of people to throw under the bus. Agent Vance released the intercom button and turned to face me fully. The ambient light from the surveillance monitors cast sharp, serious shadows across her face. "We have enough evidence to put DeAndre away for 20 years, Vance stated, her tone shifting from observational to deadly serious. "We have Thomas on racketeering and Brenda on accessory to wire fraud. Brittany will be joining them for forging the mortgage and hiding illicit funds. The federal side of this equation is completely locked down." I met her gaze, waiting silently. In my line of work, there was always a catch when the federal government intervened with cartel capital. "But we have a massive, immediate problem," Vance continued, taking a deliberate step closer to me. "Your trap worked perfectly. We intercepted the wire transfers. We froze the fraudulent accounts. We have the ledgers. But the Sinaloa cartel is still missing $1 million in liquid cash, and their midnight deadline is less than 10 hours away." I raised a skeptical eyebrow. "That sounds like DeAndre's problem. He is the one who took their money. Let him explain it to them from his holding cell." "The cartel does not care about holding cells," Alyssa Vance said grimly, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "When midnight strikes and their money does not clear, they will not just write it off as a bad investment. They will send a message. They know DeAndre is in custody, so they will go after the collateral. They will go after anyone sharing the Wilson bloodline to make a horrific example out of the unpaid debt. We can offer you protective custody, but you know how these syndicates operate. They have a very long, very violent reach. I kept my posture perfectly relaxed, betraying none of the tension that suddenly spiked in my chest. What are you proposing, Agent Vance? Vance tapped her tablet again, pulling up a deeply buried, highly encrypted asset file. Your forensic sweep was thorough, Alyssa, but you missed one final safety net. Thomas created a blind trust 10 years ago, completely detached from the Wilson Holding Company and shielded from the current asset freeze. It contains exactly $1.2 million in untraceable bearer bonds. Vance locked her eyes onto mine, delivering the final devastating hook. We need you to authorize the immediate liquidation of that blind trust. We use the bonds to quietly pay off the cartel and prevent a bloodbath tonight. But there is a catch. Thomas named you as the sole executor of the trust, and authorizing this transfer means you will have to admit to the federal government that you knew about his hidden assets all along. I stared at Agent Vance, the hum of the observation room suddenly feeling oppressive. Thomas had made me the executor of a blind trust without my knowledge, a classic maneuver to shield his illicit funds behind my clean, heavily vetted financial license. If I authorized the transfer, I risked implicating myself in a federal conspiracy. But if I refused, the cartel would hunt down my bloodline, dragging me into a war I did not start. I did not know about the trust, Vance. I stated, my voice devoid of hesitation. My father forged my digital signature on the executor assignment. It is a textbook layering tactic, but I have the master override credentials for Wilson Holdings legacy accounts. Print the liquidation authorization and the federal restitution waivers. I am not just going to authorize the transfer. I am going to make him sign away his entire life. Vance nodded, signaling a junior agent to draft the paperwork. 10 minutes later, I walked out of the observation room and pushed open the heavy steel door of interrogation room B. Thomas and Brenda sat on opposite sides of a bolted-down aluminum table. They wore matching orange jumpsuits, the stark institutional fabric stripping away the last remnants of their country club veneer. Brenda was sobbing quietly into her hands. Thomas stared blankly at the gray wall, his posture completely hollowed out. I dropped a thick stack of federal transfer documents onto the metal table. The sharp slap made them both flinch. The cartel deadline is midnight, I said, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. DeAndre failed to secure the funds. The wire is frozen. In exactly 4 hours, the Sinaloa Syndicate is going to start executing our extended family to settle the debt. They will not stop with DeAndre. They will target you. They will target Brittany, and they will target me. Thomas looked up, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. We have nothing left, Alyssa. The feds took it all. You have exactly $1.2 million in untraceable bearer bonds sitting in a blind trust in the Cayman Islands, I corrected, tapping a manicured fingernail against the top document. You named me as the sole executor to hide it from the IRS. You used my clean financial record as a shield for your dirty money. But that shield just became your executioner. Brenda gasped, her hands dropping to the table. You cannot touch that money, Alyssa. That is our absolute last resort. That is our survival fund for when we get out. You are never getting out, Mom, I stated brutally. You are facing federal wire fraud and conspiracy charges. You are going to die in a federal penitentiary. The only choice you have left is whether you die by natural causes in a cell or by a cartel hit squad. I slid a black pen across the table. It rolled and hit Thomas's chained wrists. This is a federal restitution and liquidation waiver, I explained, leaning over the table so I was eye level with my father. By signing this, you acknowledge the trust is yours, you admit to the fraudulent executor assignment, and you authorize the immediate release of the bonds. The federal government will route the funds to cover the syndicate debt and seize the remaining balance for restitution. You will literally be left with zero. Nothing. Not a single penny to your name. Thomas stared at the pen as if it were a venomous snake. His hands shook violently. Alyssa, please, he croaked, tears finally spilling over his wrinkled cheeks. It is everything I built. My entire legacy. Do not leave us with nothing. I did not feel a shred of pity. I looked at his trembling hands and remembered the smug, condescending sneer he wore just months ago in my old office. "Do you remember the day you cornered me at my desk?" I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "You threw a $50,000 check in my face. You told me my firm was a cute little hobby. You demanded I abandon my career, my independence, and my self-respect to come clean up DeAndre's messes. You tried to buy my life's work for pennies." I tapped the pen against the metal table. "Pick it up, Thomas. You tried to buy my submission with pocket change. Now I am buying your freedom for everything you own." Thomas let out a broken, guttural sob. He picked up the pen with trembling, chained hands. He signed his name on the dotted line, his tears staining the federal seal at the bottom of the page. Brenda wailed a high, piercing sound of absolute despair as she took the pen next and scrawled her signature, officially signing away her entire existence. I snatched the papers back, turning on my heel without a single word of comfort, and walked out the heavy steel door. By the following morning, the immediate threat of violence had been neutralized. The funds had cleared the international routing traps, appeasing the syndicate just hours before their deadline. But the legal massacre had only just begun. I stood in the gallery of the federal courthouse watching the arraignment hearings. DeAndre was led in wearing a prison-issued jumpsuit, his hands and ankles heavily shackled. The federal judge did not even hesitate. Citing the extreme flight risk and his ties to international money laundering syndicates, the judge officially indicted DeAndre on 34 counts of financial fraud and summarily denied bail. He was remanded to federal custody, dragged out of the courtroom, while screaming for his lawyer. Brittany was not at the courtroom. She had posted a minimal bond by liquidating her remaining jewelry, but her freedom was entirely cosmetic. The federal government had seized her home, frozen her credit, and confiscated her vehicles. I walked out of the courthouse and checked my phone. My screen was flooded with notifications from my firm's surveillance monitors. Brittany was sleeping on a wooden bench at a downtown bus station. Her socialite friends, the women she had bought with endless brunches and luxury vacations funded by stolen money, had entirely blocked her numbers and barred her from their gated communities. The golden child was left completely homeless, utterly destitute, and abandoned by everyone she thought loved her. 1 month later, the crystal chandeliers of the Oak Ridge Country Club cast a warm golden glow over the annual spring gala. The air hummed with the soft jazz of a live band, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the low murmur of old money exchanging pleasantries. I handed the keys of my newly purchased Aston Martin to the valet, smoothing the skirt of my midnight blue silk gown. Walking through the grand oak double doors, I felt the immediate shift in the room's atmosphere. A year ago, at this exact event, my mother had banished me to a drafty table near the kitchen doors. She had claimed the lighting there was better suited for my boring, practical aesthetic, ensuring Brittany and DeAndre held court at the center table next to the mayor. Tonight, the club manager practically sprinted across the foyer to greet me, bowing his head in deference, before personally escorting me to the absolute center of the ballroom. The social hierarchy of Oak Ridge had violently realigned. The high society matrons who had spent the last decade turning their noses up at my accounting firm now descended upon my table like moths to a spotlight. Beatrice Sterling, a woman who had once loudly mocked my sensible shoes at a charity luncheon, leaned over my shoulder with a dazzling, predatory smile. "Alyssa, darling." Beatrice purred, her eyes scanning my designer gown with naked calculation. "We have missed you at the club. Your firm is doing such remarkable things. I was just telling my husband we need to move our corporate accounts under your management." They did not care about my accounting skills. They cared about power. The Wilson family's spectacular, catastrophic implosion had been front-page news for weeks. Everyone in this room knew that I was the one left standing. They knew I had retained the building, the wealth, and the immaculate reputation while the rest of my bloodline burned in federal court. I smiled back at Beatrice, a perfectly polite, impenetrable mask. "I appreciate the sentiment, Beatrice." I replied, my voice smooth and level. "But my firm is currently entirely booked managing high-net-worth assets. I will have my assistant place you on our wait list." Beatrice flushed, masking her disappointment with a tight nod before retreating. I took a sip of my sparkling water, letting the sweet taste of absolute independence settle over me. I did not need to be cruel to these people. My mere presence, unbothered and thriving, was enough to establish my dominance. As the band transitioned to a slower tempo, a server in a stiff, poorly fitted white button-down shirt and black slacks approached my table. She carried a heavy silver tray of hors d'oeuvres, her shoulders hunched forward, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. "Care for a crab cake, ma'am?" The server mumbled, her voice rough and exhausted. I looked up. The breath hitched slightly in my throat, though I forced my expression to remain entirely blank. It was Brenda. The woman who used to dictate the club's floral arrangements and terrorize the waitstaff over lukewarm soup was now serving it. Without her weekly salon blowouts, expensive manicures, and diamond tennis bracelets, she looked remarkably small. The harsh reality of minimum wage labor had aged her a decade in a single month. The federal government had seized their bank accounts, and I had forced them to liquidate their final offshore safety net to prevent a cartel bloodbath. They were left with absolutely nothing. Now Brenda was passing out appetizers to pay the mounting legal fees for her court-appointed public defender. Brenda raised her head, finally making eye contact with me. The silver tray in her hands rattled violently as she realized who she was serving. All the color drained from her face, leaving her a ghostly, sallow white. She opened her mouth, her lips trembling, but no sound came out. The sheer suffocating weight of her humiliation hung in the air between us. I did not flinch. I did not offer her a sad smile, nor did I twist the knife with a sarcastic remark. I simply looked at the tray, picked up a small cocktail napkin, and met her eyes with absolute chilling indifference. "No, thank you," I said. Brenda swallowed hard, a tear spilling over her eyelashes and cutting a track through her cheap foundation. She hastily bowed her head and practically fled toward the kitchen, nearly colliding with a busboy carrying a bin of dirty dishes. I watched the busboy steady the plastic bin, apologizing profusely to the guests he had bumped into. He turned his face toward the light, and I recognized my father. Thomas Wilson, the former titan of corporate real estate, the man who used to boast about his golf handicap on these very greens, was scraping half-eaten salmon off fine china. His shoulders were bowed under the weight of the plastic tub, his face hollow and defeated. He wiped sweat from his brow with a soiled rag, trudging back toward the kitchens without looking up. I turned my attention back to the stage, feeling the last lingering strings of my childhood obligations dissolve into nothing. The scales were perfectly balanced. Suddenly, a harsh, shrill scream ripped through the elegant murmur of the ballroom. The jazz band faltered, several musicians dropping their notes as heads turned toward the grand entrance. Two burly security guards were grappling with a woman desperately trying to claw her way into the gala. She looked manic. Her blonde hair was a matted, tangled mess, and she was wearing a wrinkled, oversized sweatshirt that looked like it had been pulled from a donation bin. "Let me go!" she shrieked, kicking wildly at the guard's shins. "I belong here. I am a member." It was Brittany. The golden child had been evicted from her luxury apartment, her credit frozen, and her husband locked in a federal penitentiary, facing decades of hard time. Her high society friends, the very people staring at her now in absolute horror, had completely abandoned her the moment her bank accounts hit zero. Brittany broke free from the guards, her eyes frantically scanning the sea of evening gowns and tuxedos until she locked onto me sitting at the center table. She ignored the gasps of the wealthy onlookers sprinting across the polished dance floor and throwing herself to her knees directly beside my chair. "Alyssa," Brittany sobbed, her voice echoing loudly in the dead-silent ballroom. "Alyssa, please, I have nothing. I am sleeping in my car. I have not eaten in 2 days. You have the firm. You have all the money. Give me a job. Let me work as your receptionist. I will answer phones. I will scrub the floors. I will do anything. Please, you have to save me." The silence in the ballroom became absolute. The jazz band abruptly ceased playing, the final discordant note from the saxophone dying awkwardly in the air. Every eye in the Oak Ridge Country Club was fixed on the spectacle unfolding at my feet. Beatrice Sterling and her circle of high society matrons stood completely frozen, their crystal champagne flutes suspended halfway to their lips, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and ravenous curiosity. Brittany's hands clawed desperately at the fabric of my chair. She stared up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, her face streaked with a mixture of dirt, sweat, and cheap mascara. She smelled faintly of gasoline and stale coffee, a stark, jarring contrast to the expensive perfumes filling the ballroom. For 30 years, those dramatic tears had been her ultimate, unbeatable weapon. They had shielded her from consequences, secured her luxury trust funds, and convinced our parents to overlook every single one of her malicious, selfish choices. Even now, completely ruined and facing federal indictment, she fully expected me to cave under the weight of public scrutiny. She thought the pressure of the staring elite would force me to play the role of the benevolent, forgiving sister just to save face. I looked down at her, my expression as unyielding and cold as carved stone. I reached for my crystal water glass, took a slow, measured sip, and set it back down on the pristine white tablecloth. "Let go of my chair, Brittany," I said. My voice was not loud, but in the cavernous, breathless quiet of the room, it carried with devastating clarity. "You are wrinkling the silk." She recoiled as if I had physically struck her, falling back onto her heels on the polished hardwood floor. "Alyssa, please," she whimpered, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You cannot do this. We are sisters. We are family." I was tricked. DeAndre ruined my life. He lied to me about the cartel money. I did not know what he was doing. I am innocent. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, fixing her with a gaze that stripped away her last remaining shreds of dignity. "Do not insult my intelligence, and do not waste the time of everyone in this room," I replied smoothly. "You are not a victim. You knew exactly where that money was coming from. In fact, you were so completely aware of the illicit funds that you actively tried to steal them from your own husband before the federal government could freeze the accounts." A collective sharp gasp rippled through the crowd of onlookers. Beatrice Sterling clutched the pearl necklace at her throat, leaning in closer to catch every word. "I did not!" Brittany shrieked, her voice pitching into a desperate defensive squeal. "That is a lie. You are making that up to turn everyone against me. I am the federal financial consultant who audited your offshore accounts, Brittany." I stated, my tone dripping with absolute, unassailable authority. "I tracked the exact digital timestamp when you forged the wire transfers. I saw the deed to the luxury villa in Monaco that you purchased using cartel capital. You bypassed DeAndre's shell companies and routed the money directly into a private account under your own name. You did not come here tonight because you are innocent. You came here because the FBI seized your Monaco villa, the cartel wants their blood money back, and you have finally run out of gullible people to manipulate." Brittany's mouth opened and closed silently, resembling a fish suffocating on dry land. The illusion she had tried to spin was completely and permanently shattered. The high society guests who had previously humored her out of respect for the Wilson wealth now looked at her with blatant, unfiltered disgust. She was no longer a fallen socialite. She was a radioactive liability. "Just give me a job," she begged, shifting her tactic from feigned innocence to raw, groveling desperation. "Just a small salary. Enough to get a motel room. Enough to buy food. I will sign a non-disclosure agreement. I will stay in the basement where no one can see me." "You have millions, Alyssa. You own the entire accounting firm. A minimum wage job is absolutely nothing to you. You owe me this." "I owe you nothing," I replied, my voice dropping to a glacial, uncompromising whisper. "For my entire life, you and our parents treated me like an expendable asset. You used my name to secure fraudulent loans. You drained my college funds to pay for your lavish, grotesque wedding. You mocked my career, my clothes, and my independence while you leeched off an international criminal syndicate." I stood up from my chair, towering over her trembling form. I looked past Brittany and scanned the perimeter of the ballroom. Standing near the swinging doors of the kitchen, frozen like statues, were Thomas and Brenda. They were still wearing their soiled staff uniforms. My mother held a serving tray tightly against her chest, her knuckles white. My father clutched a dirty cleaning rag, his shoulders slumped. They were watching the absolute destruction of their golden child, paralyzed by the horrific realization that this pathetic creature on the floor was the direct result of their own parenting. I turned my attention back to Brittany. Do you remember the day I came to Mom and Dad begging for a small loan to cover my accounting certification exams? I asked, projecting my voice so my parents could hear every single syllable clearly across the room. You were sitting on the couch, browsing a catalog for your third luxury SUV. Mom handed you a platinum credit card and turned to me with a sneer. I locked eyes with Brittany, reciting the exact words Brenda had used to dismiss me all those years ago, replacing my name with hers to deliver the ultimate poetic justice. You need to learn how to survive in the real world, Brittany. Consider this your first lesson. Brittany let out a gut-wrenching feral wail. She lunged forward desperately, reaching for the hem of my midnight blue gown, but the two burly security guards were already there. They grabbed her by the arms, hauling her roughly to her feet. No, she screamed, thrashing wildly as her feet left the hardwood floor. You cannot leave me like this. Alyssa, they are going to kill me. You have to save me. The guards dragged her backward across the polished dance floor. Her frantic screams echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, growing fainter as they forced her through the heavy oak double doors and out into the cold, unforgiving night air. The heavy echoing thud of the doors closing behind her signaled the absolute final severance of my ties to the Wilson family. I remained standing calmly, smoothing the silk of my gown. The silence in the ballroom was profound, heavy with the weight of the spectacle they had just witnessed. Slowly, I shifted my gaze back to the kitchen doors. Thomas and Brenda had not moved an inch. They stood in silent shame, their faces pale, sunken, and utterly defeated. They had spent 3 decades building a toxic legacy of fraud, entitlement, and cruelty, and in a matter of minutes they had watched it completely evaporate. They finally realized the sheer magnitude of what they had destroyed, and that there was absolutely no one left to save them. I sat back down, picked up my sparkling water, and offered a polite nod to the band leader. The soft jazz resumed, and I enjoyed the rest of my evening. I stared down at my sister. The raw desperation in her voice was a jarring, almost grotesque contrast to the decades of arrogant entitlement she had worn like a crown. She clung to the midnight blue silk of my gown, her tears leaving dark, wet stains on the fabric, surrounded by the breathless, electrified silence of the Oak Ridge Country Club. I did not pull away immediately. I let her sit there on her knees, forcing her to let the reality of her position marinate under the blinding, unforgiving light of public scrutiny. The high society matrons who had once fawned over her designer bags now physically stepped back, pulling their expensive evening gowns tight against their legs as if her poverty were a contagious disease. "You expect me to believe you did not know what DeAndre was doing?" I asked, my voice dropping to a glacial, uncompromising register that carried effortlessly across the quiet ballroom. "You expect anyone in this room to believe that?" Brittany sobbed, nodding frantically, her tangled blonde hair falling across her face. "I swear, Alyssa, I just signed the papers he gave me. I am an innocent victim." "You signed the operating agreements for 7 different shell companies," I stated, ticking the facts off with clinical, devastating precision. "You personally authorized the international wire transfers to the Cayman accounts. You drove the 6-figure sports cars, you wore the cartel-funded diamonds, and you actively mocked anyone who actually worked for a living. You were not a victim, Brittany. You were a willing, enthusiastic accomplice." Her grip on my dress loosened. The attendees, once her loyal subjects, murmured in blatant disgust. "You cornered me at my office just a few months ago." I continued, taking a deliberate step back so she fell forward slightly onto the polished hardwood. "You threw a check in my face. You told me my career was a cute little hobby. You demanded I abandon my firm to clean up your husband's mess so you could maintain your illusion of superiority. Now that the illusion is completely shattered, you want to play the helpless martyr. It will not work." I signaled to the security guards, who immediately stepped forward, grabbing her firmly by the arms. As they hoisted her up, I leaned in close, ensuring my voice carried straight to the kitchen doors, where our parents stood frozen. "Do you remember what Mom told me the day she forced me to hand over my college savings to pay for your lavish wedding?" I asked, my eyes locking onto Brenda's pale, sunken face across the room before snapping back to Brittany. "She said, you need to learn how to survive in the real world. Consider this your first lesson." Brittany let out a gut-wrenching feral wail as the guards dragged her backward. Her frantic screams echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings, growing fainter and more desperate as they forced her through the heavy oak double doors and out into the cold night. I turned my attention back to the kitchen doors. Thomas and Brenda had not moved an inch. The silver tray in my mother's hands finally slipped from her trembling fingers, crashing to the floor with a deafening clatter that made several guests jump. They stood in silent, paralyzing shame, their faces hollow and utterly defeated. Looking at the aftermath of their golden child's public destruction, they finally realized the sheer magnitude of what they had lost. I turned my back on them, returning to my table without a second glance. 6 months later, the morning air was crisp and thick with the promise of new beginnings. I stood at the center of the downtown warehouse district, wearing a tailored white suit and a bright yellow hard hat. The crumbling, abandoned commercial building my grandfather had left me in his will, the exact same building my father had once called a worthless pile of bricks when he tried to force me to sell it to cover Brittany's mounting debts, now towered behind me. It was framed by towering construction cranes and heavy steel scaffolding. This was no longer just a dilapidated shell. It was the future headquarters of Wilson Financial Holdings and the anchor of a massive multi-million-dollar urban revitalization project. I gripped the ceremonial silver shovel, flanked not by blood relatives, but by the people who had truly earned my loyalty. To my right stood Marcus, my lead forensic accountant, who had worked tirelessly by my side to navigate the federal audits and shield my firm from the cartel fallout. To my left was Diane, the fierce corporate attorney who had ensured every single asset I owned was protected by impenetrable legal armor. They were my chosen family, a circle built entirely on mutual respect, competence, and unwavering trust, rather than toxic obligation and guilt. To building legacies that last, I announced to the crowd, driving the shovel deep into the earth and tossing the first mound of dirt. Flashbulbs erupted from the local press, capturing the milestone. The crowd of angel investors and city officials applauded enthusiastically. There was no inherited wealth here, no dirty cartel money, no manipulative strings attached. Every brick of this new empire was mine, secured through relentless hard work, strategic patience, and an absolute refusal to be a victim of my family's greed. Later that evening, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my pristine downtown penthouse. The city skyline stretched out below me, a glittering sea of lights reflecting off the dark, quiet surface of the river. The soft hum of the evening news played on the flat-screen television behind me. The anchor's voice was crisp and professional. In federal court today, DeAndre Sterling was officially sentenced to 25 years without the possibility of parole for his role in a massive international money laundering syndicate. I poured myself a glass of vintage champagne, listening as the broadcast seamlessly transitioned to the collateral damage. Court records also confirm the finalization of Chapter 7 bankruptcy proceedings for Thomas and Brenda Wilson, former real estate moguls tied to the Sterling fallout. The couple's remaining personal assets have been fully liquidated to cover outstanding federal restitution. They had absolutely nothing left. The kingdom they had built on favoritism, manipulation, and deceit had been razed to the ground. I took a slow sip of the champagne, the cold, crisp bubbles burning pleasantly against my tongue. I turned away from the city lights and looked at the center wall of my living room. Hanging there, framed in sleek black metal and illuminated by a single focused gallery light, was the irrevocable trust document. It was the piece of paper that had shielded my grandfather's building legally, severed me from my parents' sinking ship, and ultimately destroyed the enemies who had tried to drag me down with them. I raised my crystal glass to the framed document, offering a silent toast to survival, unyielding independence, and the sweet, absolute perfection of a self-made empire. I smiled. The screen fades to black. The most profound lesson from Alyssa's journey is that true security and self-worth can never be derived from a toxic environment, even if it is your own family. When blood relatives demand your submission in exchange for conditional love, the bravest choice you can make is to walk away. Alyssa proved that setting uncompromising boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but an act of essential self-preservation. By relying on her own resilience and building a chosen family of loyal allies, she transformed betrayal into absolute triumph. Have you ever had to cut toxic ties to protect your future? Share your story in the comments below